Hey everyone, and welcome to a brand new video. Tonight we have a single series by the name of It's Time I Told You About Our Film. A huge thank you to the author for allowing me to narrate the story for all of you. I hope you all enjoy it. I know that some of you really like the longer series, such as the Cursed VHS tapes or some of the other ones that we've done over the years. I think this one is right up there with them. Make sure to drop a like if you do enjoy. Subscribing if you are new is also very much appreciated, as I post long-form narration just like this all of the time. Sit back, do whatever it is that you do to relax, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. It's been a week since Edith M. Carroll died. She was found dead in her bathroom, having choked on something. It's an eerie fact, but most people who choke to death do so in their bathroom. Instead of running outside to get help, they go into the bathroom to try and cough it up, often locking the door out of habit. I don't like to think about it. She deserved better. A lot of people don't know about Edith. Some might call her the part-time lady at the bakery, or the one who worked in administration at the local community college. Not a lot of people know that in the late 1970s, she was the co-writer for a horror movie. As of her passing, I'm the last living member of the film crew. Given the events that took place, most of us collectively agreed to never talk openly about it, but seeing as there's no one left to trouble, I figure it's high time someone pulled back the curtain. And as someone about to hit 70, now's not the time to wait for better days. I was born in 1957. I finished my studies during the height of the Vietnam War, and by the time I turned 20, we were knee-deep in psychedelics and a stagnating economy. I was working part-time at the cinema, trying to save enough to follow my on-again, off-again girlfriend to San Francisco. We broke up when she left town to pursue a degree in economics. Through my cinema job, I got to know a few regulars, the kind of people who were first in line with every new release. One of these regulars was a man named Seb. The guy drove an azure blue '68 Frog Eye Sprite, and always had something interesting to tell. Little bits of trivia about whatever movie he came to see. Over the course of a few months, we became good friends. I handed him the occasional free popcorn, and he'd talk my ear off about whatever movie was showing. Turns out, Seb was a gaffer. He handled electronics, mostly lights, on small-scale movie sets. At the initial showing of The Hills Have Eyes, Seb was first in line. He was more eager than usual. He'd actually shaved off his beard and combed his hair, even without bringing a date, like he often did. He paid for his popcorn and gave me a $20 tip. "Heading out tomorrow," he said. "Got a job out of state. Heading for the big leagues." "Doing a movie?" I asked. "Like a real one?" "As real as it gets." He grinned. "Big budget stuff." "Promise you'll be back for the first screening, right?" Yeah, he nodded. "It's happening." I handed him his popcorn and a Coke. Seb stopped. He looked up, squinted at me, and sighed. Nodding to himself, he finally smiled. "You want a job?" Seb needed an equipment assistant. You can get a long way with a shared love of cinema and a can-do attitude. At least back then. I signed on so fast his popcorn didn't get cold. Not before long I was handed the official title of Gaffer's Assistant, or Best Boy Grip. We were given a few days to prepare. We were joining a film crew up in New England, but most of the crew were Midwestern. Our first meetup would be on site in a small coastline town just northeast of Brunswick. I joined Seb on a long drive all the way up there in the middle of summer, blasting music all the way. We took turns road tripping, cross country. The frog guy was a beast to handle. He told me all about the movie in excruciating detail. It was the passion project of a writer gone director named Roy Hampton. He'd mostly worked in advertising and network TV, so this was a sort of breakout project. Still, it was a lot of money involved. Seb had no idea where the financing was even coming from. The movie had signed on a stage actor from Dallas named Dawn Anderson, who was making her debut on the big screen. The script was an adaptation of a story called The Crown of Io by a turn-of-the-century writer named Emmett. A risk. It was originally intended as a sort of drama piece, but it had been rewritten into a horror script inspired by movies like The Wicker Man, Rosemary's Baby, and The Omen. I remember Seb talking about it. Even while driving, he was enthusiastically waving his hands around, talking as much with his body as with his mouth. He couldn't stop smiling. That man loved his job. We went past Brunswick to the coastline town of Chatterblinds. There were less than 1,000 people living there in total, so there was little in the way of amenities, but enough to make ourselves comfortable. Some of the crew had rented out what little rooms there were at the local B&B. Others were bringing caravans and minibuses. Just going through town, we could see a couple of trailers lined up by the side of the road. Seb seemed to know some of the people we passed. He waved as we made our way through town. Every other street or so, someone would look up and wave back. It was shaping up to be a beautiful summer. There was a fenced-off area at the outskirts of town where we turned in. We followed a bumpy dirt road, lined with birch trees, along a solid chain-linked fence with a guarded gate up front. Seb handed over his ID to one of the security guards. Took them a while to find him on the list, but he was on there. Digman, the guard said. Sebastian Digman. You haven't signed up for on-site housing. Camping out? Seb smiled, nodding towards the trunk of his car. My assistant here could use a place to crash, though. Got some spare tents by the equipment lot, and some folks are bringing in folding cots to the mess hall. It ain't much, but y'all are free to grab what you need. Seb turned to me. I could see my reflection in his wide-framed sunglasses. What you thinking? He asked. You camping out or sticking to the mess hall? Mess hall. I grinned back. You know that's where the party's gonna be at. Seb gave me a sheepish grin as the gates opened. We rolled in without a word. The guard waved us off. Good luck and God bless. I spent the rest of the day hanging on to Seb for dear life. We were chasing down scripts and inventory lists, double-checking that everything he'd asked for was there. Every cable, every box of screws, every replacement bulb. Seb was a goof, but about this one particular thing, he was a machine. Meticulous. I did get to see some of the other folks in the periphery. The special effects team were hard at work, going something over with the script writer. I think Edith was there too. The main script writer was scratching his head and redlining revisions, assisted by his co-writer, Edith. I caught a glimpse of the director as well, having a heated discussion with the camera crew. I saw Dawn, the main lead. She was simultaneously comparing notes between two different scripts, as they hadn't settled on which one to go for yet. I think that was the only day when I didn't see her wearing some kind of blue sundress, the iconic get-up of her character. Seb had managed to get a hold of an earlier script and went through the scene markups. I was sealing up boxes with this thick industrial tape while he smoked, flipping through the pages. It was all done by a typewriter, and there were smudges of ink on his fingers. They renamed it again. He sighed. First it was the Crown of Io, then the Queen of Black Sands, and now... He held it up, red text on a white background. End of Eternity. I nodded. Creepy. They'll probably change it again, he said between puffs of smoke. Sounds too artsy, European. We're not gonna be a Fulci film. He ripped out one of the pages and handed the rest over to me. It was massive. What's the runtime on this thing? I scoffed. 12 hours? Original was about 3.5, he said, shaking his head. They've cut it down to 3. Final version is probably about 2.5. He handed the ripped out page back to me and put his cigarette out on a nearby fuse box. Throw it away when you're done, he said, stretching out. It's already old news. Later that night, we all gathered in the mess hall. There was a surprising amount of staff, numbering close to 100. I was in the thick of it, stuck between technicians, extras, costume designers, makeup artists. Everyone was there, shoulder to shoulder. Seb was somewhere up front. Roy Hampton took center stage, stepping up on top of a rickety plastic table. He threw his arms out, gesturing towards us, and was met with a big cheer. I couldn't help but to join in. To the end of eternity, he laughed. He was a fit man in his early 40s, a thinning hairline underscored by a large pair of round reading glasses and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a colorful turtleneck sweater despite the summer heat. Others joined in, repeating End of Eternity like a eager echo. Tomorrow is the first day of shooting. Scene markups will be out in a couple of hours, so get ready for a late night and an early morning. But that don't mean we can't have fun. He laughed, smacking his hands together. Others joined in. I want you all to take some time and reflect on where you are, what we are about to do, to make our mark on cinema history in a way that no one's done before. No matter what we end up making here, and no matter the outcome, we have already won. There was a surge of applause. I could hear Seb up front doing a loud whistle. It's gonna be rough, but it's a space for miracles to happen. Take some time to get caught up to speed, then take the night off. Work hard, play hard. That last sentiment was echoed the loudest, and by the time Roy stepped down, I could tell someone was already lighting up some refreshments in the crowd. Seb didn't need me for the rest of the day, so I stuck around the mess hall. I got a tour of the equipment sign-out lot, and was handed a sleeping bag and a folding cot. By the time I got back, the mess hall was jumping with energy. Someone had brought a whole bunch of Kiss tapes, along with plenty of drinks. There were 4 six-packs on one of the counters with a large note that just said, "Everyone drinks." I wasn't gonna pass on that. I had a couple of drinks, a couple of smokes, and did my best to remember the lyrics to Shout It Out Loud. I huddled up with a bunch of background extras that were scheduled for the next day, playing a mix of Truth or Dare and Battleship. Don't ask about the rules to that one. I don't have the slightest idea. I talked to people from all over. Some of the practical effects guys were complete geeks, comparing notes on everything from timed explosions to faking a scalding water effect. I remember sharing a beer with the writers too. All in all, it was a good time. I think I made out with Dawn's hairdresser. Somewhere around midnight, about a dozen more people joined us. They looked a bit more businessy, having starched white shirts and black tees. They were all smiles though, but I could tell they were a bit hesitant to join us. I didn't hear much about who they were, just the occasional dismissal. "We're just finishing up," one of them said. "Long day." "Someone's gotta lock up," another said. "Make sure we're set for tomorrow." We didn't mind. This was a closed set, and with the amount of staff we had on board, there were bound to be a few unfamiliar faces. Still, there was one face I couldn't look away from. A woman in her late 50s. She was the only one of them who didn't smile. Her rose blonde hair was sort of pushed down, as if she'd worn a hat or a cap for most of the day. She too was wearing a white shirt, buttoned up all the way to her throat. I only caught a glimpse of her briefly before she disappeared into the back. I didn't think much of it. Still, I'll never forget that face. It was telling me something. I nodded at the counter full of free-to-take refreshments and urged one of them to join us. I was met with an immediate headshake and an apologetic smile, with a vague excuse about an early morning. But I noticed, as soon as they thought I wasn't looking, that their smile faded. Their eyes grew cold. As they looked around the room, I didn't see a kindness in their eyes, or a sense of belonging. I saw disgust. What happened next is etched into my memory. The woman with the pressed-down hair came back, dragging a camera along on a tripod dolly. One of our 3 main cameras for this entire shoot. Top-of-the-line kind of stuff. Extremely expensive. Coming back into the mess hall, she pushed it. It came crashing down, stopping every conversation in the room. All that remained were the voices of Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, singing their hearts out. Seconds later, one of the men with white shirts picked up our 8-track player and smashed it against the side of a table. People got up on their feet, as the woman who destroyed our camera was handed a shovel by a guy coming out of the storage closet. Turning it to the side, she chopped down on the camera like she was cutting firewood. Plastic, glass, metal, and electronics, all broken and torn into ribbons. She was completely unhinged, grunting like an animal with every strike. People started to filter out through the doors. She looked up at us with tears flowing from her eyes, her face red from exertion and anger. She was screaming at us and crying. She bawled her eyes out, smashing the camera to pieces. As the men in the white shirts advanced, screams erupted. Panic. I was too far from the exits to get out in time. One of the men zeroed in on me, following me through the mess hall. We circled a table back and forth like something out of a cartoon. Finally, he got fed up and tried to jump across. I had to think fast and ducked, pushing the table up. The weight caused it to flip, sending him sprawling onto the floor. That's when I first noticed that he was holding a knife. There were 2 main doors leading out of the mess hall, and the one leading further into the building to the equipment lot. The door closest to me, leading outside, was closed. The others had gotten out and barricaded it. The other door leading out was on the far side of the room, across from at least 6 of these people. The only other way out was through the equipment lot, right by the woman with the shovel. I didn't really have a choice. I burst into a sprint, knocking over 2 chairs along the way. The plastic pitter-patter against the linoleum floor felt like a mockery. The woman with the shovel wasn't prepared, but she took a swing at me, crashing through 3 empty bottles on the counter as she did. I got by, but not by a great margin. The equipment lot was much larger than it had any right to be. It had been used as a sort of industrial warehouse a decade earlier, and we didn't need more than a quarter of it. Rushing through the door, I saw 2 other men in white shirts pouring turpentine into a box of candles. I had to think fast. Right around the corner, I'd been sorting out equipment with Seb earlier. Keeping up a full sprint, I went straight for the lights. I heard approaching footsteps trying to keep up behind me. Thinking back on where I'd seen Seb put out his cigarette, I rounded a corner, almost tripped over a cheap plastic chair, and grabbed the fuse box. With 2 clicks, I first turned the power off, then ripped out whatever fuses I could grab in the dark. Then I slowly crept backwards, squeezing into a small space behind one of the industrial-sized shelves. There was no backplate to the shelf, so if they had flashlights, they'd see me instantly. But I was banking hard on them not bringing anything but knives and pipes. As long as it was dark, they wouldn't find me. I tried to steady my breathing and keep still. My belt buckle kept tapping against the metal siding, forcing me to put my hand in between. I was scorching hot, having to brush away a sweaty strand of hair to not get poked in the eye. I just stood there waiting. I could hear them approaching, a knife running across thick metal bars, footsteps slowing down. There were at least 3 of them now. A whisper in the dark. The woman with the shovel. "You think bringing him back will be your salvation?" She laughed. "Do you honestly think in your heart of hearts that he will do anything but to suck your spirit dry?" I didn't answer. I held my breath. "You cursed, demented people," she spat. "You don't consider that. What you do have consequences." Way in the back of the storage area, I could see a cone of light. They'd found a flashlight. They started to yell at one another to find the other cameras. One of them were cutting up cables, and another had set fire to a small box of spare parts. They were almost out of turpentine, and were now looking for something easily flammable to pile on. I could see the vague outlines of the woman with the shovel, her heavy panting making her shoulders rise and fall. "Killing you is doing you a favor," she shrieked. "I'm not killing. I'm protecting the innocent. I'm protecting the people who matter. She smacked the shovel against the side of a shelf, making it rattle. A clang rung out, bouncing against the corrugated walls. It made the wall vibrate, tickling my spine. "Where are the cameras?" There was a chatter up front. One of them was relaying something important. The others had started to pack up, grabbing whatever they could, and leaving through the front. As they did, they scanned the room a final time, looking for our cameras, or tapes. I figured they were with the director. He'd probably be up reviewing test footage ahead of the first shoot. As the flashlight panned across the room, I caught a brief glimpse of the woman with the shovel. She had this wide-eyed look on her face, like she'd never blinked. Her cheeks were stained with tears. "Destroy yourself," she cried out. "Debauch yourself and choke, you worm." Dropping the shovel, as if ending the conversation, she took a quick look around the room, and I think, right before she left, she caught a glimpse of me. I felt a dark lump sink into my stomach. There was hesitation. She peered down at the shovel. Then she left. I don't know how long I stood there. I felt like I'd fused with the ground. Like my shoes were too heavy to move. It wasn't until I heard sirens in the distance that I hurried back to the fuse box. My hands were shaking so bad that it took me 3 tries to put it all back. Hitting the switch, the light came back on, showing little but scattered tools and a burned box as witnesses to what had happened back there. People were gathering around the mess hall. I joined them outside, my legs visibly shaking. There was an uncomfortable coastline chill running through the summer night, carrying an unfamiliar smell. 2 police vehicles approached in the distance as we counted off everyone who'd been inside. Turns out, these people had a little help from the inside. 4 of the crew members and a night guard had up and left with them, leaving behind a broken gate, slashed tires, and several smashed windshields. They'd started a fire in one of the trailers, but it had burned out without causing too much damage. Still, people were shook. Some talked about leaving. There was an emergency crew meeting. Our security chief promised far and wide about how they'd take extra measures before hiring any locals, and that they'd double patrols. They promised that they'd figure out what was going on, and the motivation behind this. They assured us that they'd coordinate their efforts with the police, and that we were free to add our testimony. I didn't even notice Seb shuffling up next to me, trying to speak over the sound of the shouting and the worried murmurs. "I was worried this might happen," he sighed. "It's a controversial script." "You know these people?" "I know their type," he added. "Look, just be careful. I thought it'd be fine, but..." He looked over to me, patted me on the back, and leaned in. "I don't know who's financing all this," he whispered, "but whoever it is has deep pockets and access to some weird, esoteric stuff." Leaning away, he put his fingers under his eyes, as if to say, "Watch out," and retreated into the crowd. Over time, we all retreated, back into tents, trailers, or whatever cheap mattress we could find. It was an uneasy night. I saw that woman's face every time I closed my eyes. I could hear the clang of metal on metal. There were still broken plastic from the camera scattered across the mess hall. The shovel was still lying there, in the middle of the equipment lot. At some point, in the middle of the night, I went outside to have a cigarette. The night air was rough, tugging at my clothes. The wind rattled the chain-linked fence. I got up and wandered all the way to the edge of the fence, and in the distance I could see something. I stomped out my cigarette and peered across the small dirt road leading up to the set. White birch trees swaying back and forth, making the wind whistle through the leaves. And there, hanging from the branches, were dozens of neatly pressed white shirts with black ties. A final reminder that this was far from over. It had just begun. After the initial shock of the first night, things quickly settled down. A well-placed group of patrolmen wandering around the yard put most of us at ease. A reminder that this thing was still in full go-ahead mode. The white shirts that had been hung outside the set as an ill omen were taken down and publicly burned. Director Roy Hampton gladly announced the schedule for the first day of filming. We were originally going to film one of the near-end scenes by the shoreline, but they changed it at the last minute to a nearby cave. Seb wasn't happy about it. He had to completely switch up the light setup he'd prepared. It'd be a few stressful hours for the both of us. Seb had to improvise a natural light filter to better fit the texture of the cave, and I had to hunt for extension cables. We couldn't keep a diesel generator in an enclosed space. We'd suffocate. Seb and I finished packing an initial setup and were escorted off-site with the rest of the tech crew. It was going to be a solo scene with Dawn, at a point in the movie where her character reluctantly accepts the influence of a timeless being into her corporeal form. The fall from grace, like Eve eating the forbidden apple. There was a small convoy heading out, with music blasting from the front. It was a bumpy ride, where Seb and I had to ride in the back to keep the equipment from falling over. We couldn't tie it all down. About 35 minutes later, we were facing a small cave. We had to drag the equipment on foot the last 200 or so feet, but the location itself was pretty impressive. The entrance to the cave was this tall slit that went up at least 8 feet. I could tell why they'd switched to this place. Very cinematic. We went inside to check the place out and start setting up. It was much more spacious than we'd anticipated. One single space in a sort of half-sphere shape, with a large pool of water in the middle. It was big enough for someone to swim around in, a group even. The cave itself was pretty rough though, It'd take some time setting up an even light. Seb nervously scratched his chin, like he wasn't sure if we'd brought enough reflectors. Director Roy and main lead Dawn arrived shortly thereafter, with an entourage of crew. Dawn was all fancied up in a blue summer dress and full makeup. She was practicing lines with one of her assistants. I couldn't stop looking at her. I'm the first to admit, I probably stared. Seb, on the other hand, was focused on the work. They say this thing is deep, he said. There's a hole in the center. What? The pool, he said. They say it's deep. Oh, I nodded. Sure. Eyes on the prize, Seb said, shaking his head. We're behind schedule. And we were. We barely managed to set up what we had for the initial shot where Dawn enters the cave. The second part, inside the cave, was still being worked on. The space was large enough for a crew of 12 to fit, but it was difficult to hear one another. Sounds just sort of bounced around. Seeing that first scene being filmed, though, that was magical. The snap of the clapperboard, the immediate silence. Everyone hunkered down into their roles. I kept an off light centered on Dawn, while Seb continuously moved one of the cables out of shot. The camera rolled, and just as scripted, Dawn turned around at the last minute, a final hesitation, a resistance to corruption. Then she turned back and headed inside. As Roy called out, "Cut!" a loud applause erupted from the crew. We were officially doing this. We did a few more takes, trying out different angles, before settling on a dolly zoom shot, an homage to Hitchcock. Roy was obsessed with the guy, and he wanted it to show in the movie. We couldn't blame him. It was a good influence to have. As we finished up the first shot and headed inside, I was brimming with excitement. I'd been unsure if I would be able to contribute, but now I know I was there and getting my hands dirty. It felt good. I felt like I could do it. I could start to see what Roy was doing and how he thought. I was picking up the names of things, just getting better overall. Well inside the cave, Dawn was going to have a conversation with a deity whose voice would be added in post-production. As Roy explored the space and discussed the various angles, one thing became increasingly clear. We couldn't all be in there at once. The space would be limited to the director, sound, the cameramen, and Dawn. The rest of us had to wait outside. Now, the mood outside was great. People were smoking and laughing. Some of the carriers were talking about bringing others up there later for a midnight swim. They were right. That place would be an amazing space to hang out. Very zen. We were a few short minutes from lunch, so some of us had to begin unpacking whatever we'd brought to eat. As noon rolled around, we could hear an audible gasp from inside the cave. At first, we didn't think much of it. I finished my lunch banana, and the others dug into their various sandwiches. Then, someone calling. We couldn't hear what he said first, but it sounded urgent. We all quieted down, only to hear it again. "Call an ambulance." Moments later, another voice. "No, no ambulance. Just get out. Get back." "She's bleeding," said a third voice. "She's not moving," said fourth. "Oh my, what's wrong with her neck?" said another. We dropped everything. One of the cameramen came stumbling out and threw up. One of his assistants tagged along to pat him on the back. But one voice was louder than the others. The director. And he was clear about two things. That everyone needed to get out, and that there would be no ambulance. Everyone filtered out of the cave one by one. Everyone but the director and Dawn. We all just stood there, holding our breaths. It was obvious that something had happened. Some kind of accident. We all looked at one another, back and forth, waiting for someone to break the silence. As it turned out, it would be the director himself who did. Roy came out with his hands up, as if trying to calm us down. He had this big smile on his face as he waved his assistant over. It's fine, he said. Dawn is just a bit shaken. She'll be on her feet in a bit. Take a long lunch, and we'll get back to it at, let's say, 2 p.m. I was rolling up a cable, standing a little closer than the director had anticipated. I could overhear a bit of what he was whispering to his assistant. Little words not meant for me. Something about fetching his notebook. Not the blue one, the black one. Then to get a guard posted at the cave. And finally, to fetch one of the makeup assistants. The brown-haired one. We weren't convinced, but there was little we could do. One of the crew who'd seen what happened said she slipped and smacked her head on one of the rocks as she stepped into the pool. Someone else said she'd started speaking gibberish. Apparently, the line she was reading was supposed to be some sort of forgotten god language. It was straight from the source material. We all went our separate ways, taking a long lunch, but some of us still weren't convinced. Two of the women from makeup and costume called the local sheriff. After all, Roy had said not to call an ambulance. He hadn't said anything about not calling the police. By the time our 2-hour lunch was up, there was a squad car parked on the dirt road leading up to the cave. Roy's assistant was being interviewed. There was something about the way he talked that made it sound like he was stalling. We all stood in a half circle listening in. They were making small talk about the movie, asking about what had happened, and wanted to see if Dawn was all right. The assistant was eager to answer. A little bit too eager, perhaps. A couple of minutes later, the director stepped out, and with him was Dawn. She looked a bit shaken. She'd covered part of her face with a towel, and she was drenched in water. She excused herself to the officers. They asked a few control questions to see if she was all there, and she had no trouble answering them. Things like her middle name, where she was born, that sort of stuff. But I don't think anyone else was thinking what I was thinking. They hadn't heard what I'd heard. Looking at her, like I'd done all morning, I could tell one thing for certain. That wasn't Dawn. They had a similar look, and they sounded the same, but the hair was a bit longer, and she was a bit shorter. If I hadn't overheard the director asking for the makeup assistant, I wouldn't have thought of it, but that wasn't Dawn. It was the woman from makeup. But how could she look and sound like Dawn that well? If it was all acting, she should have been the one in front of the camera to begin with. The sheriff and deputy excused themselves, wished us the best of luck, and headed out. Roy decided to postpone the next shooting a couple of hours so Dawn could dry off and get her makeup redone. Looking at the crowd, I could tell there were others who had questions. Maybe they didn't know exactly what was off, but we were all getting worried. Something had gone terribly wrong. Later that day, we finished the shot in the cave. We picked up the equipment and called it an early day. The camera crew stayed a bit late just to get some environment shots, and the sound guys got some background noise. Seb and I headed back with one of the equipment vans. I sat next to Seb in the back, bouncing up and down as the suspension held on for dear life. "You seen the black book he carries?" I asked. "You know what's up with that?" "I think it's the original," nodded Seb. "Like a copy of the original book. The Rask book. He refers to it all the time." Seb looked ahead, watching the driver fiddle with the radio. Knowing we weren't actively being listened to, Seb quieted down. "We got a lot of wiggle room when it comes to scenes and casting, but every line of dialogue is straight from that book. Even the crazy god babble stuff? Especially that." Seb lit up a cigarette and passed it to me. I took it, contemplating in silence. Later that night, the crew that were sleeping on site had another get-together. We were all a bit weary from the other night, but spirits were relatively high. Most of the people who'd been scared had left the set altogether, so those who remained were those who didn't care enough to be bothered. I wasn't really in a party mood, still not knowing what to make of what had happened, but I figured I could at least check out the cave, see if I could spot anything out of place. The others just wanted a reason to get their drink on. There were 12 of us crammed into 2 very small cars. We rolled all the way back to the cave, armed with flashlights, a portable 8-track player, and plenty of drinks. People were singing all the way there, and I'm the first to admit, it was hard not to get in the mood. As we got back to the cave, we noticed something peculiar. One of the security guards from the set was stationed there, reading a magazine. As we approached, he perked up and shone a light on us. "No entry," he said. "Y'all can go party somewhere else." "Come on, man," someone protested. "It's been a rough day." "Why can't we go in?" another one asked. The guard just shook his head. "Director's orders. Gotta keep it clean for reshoots." I stepped up carefully, taking a deep breath and releasing the stress from my shoulders. I put on my bravest smile. Now I was even more curious. "Look, are you going to sit here all night?" I asked. "If we're reshooting here, we gotta put all the lights back up anyway. It'll be a mess no matter what we do, so what's the harm in letting us kick back a little?" He looked me up and down, not sure what to make of it. "We won't throw any trash around," I continued, "and you can stick around if you want." He looked back at the rest of the group, letting his flashlight pan over them, one by one. "Y'all got beer?" Minutes later, we were all back inside the cave, music blasting from the 8-track. It wasn't as good as the one that had been smashed by the white shirts, but it did the trick. We had to settle for country music though. The man with the Kiss tapes had left. While the others stripped into their birthday suits and plunged into the pool inside the cave, I took some time to check for any traces of what had happened. Any signs of blood, or anything really. It didn't take long for me to realize there was nothing of interest around. I sat down by the 8-track player and cranked up the volume. The guard had stripped down too, joining the others in the pool. I wasn't feeling it. Not yet, at least. Apparently the water was warmer than anticipated, and the flashlights made the ripples reflect off the rough cave surface. Every laugh echoed, every ticklish squeak, all of it. As I was about to switch cassettes on the 8-track, I noticed the laughter slowly dying down. I looked up only to see the 12 other people just standing there in the middle of the pool. They'd stopped laughing, talking, and playing. Instead, they stared at one another in what seemed like disbelief. It was such an eerie sight. A dozen people, as naked as the day God made them, their minds going blank in unison. One of the camera assistants looked down at his hands, then up at the others. What happened?" he asked. They were all looking down at their hands and the water. One of them looked straight to me. "Did I get the line right?" she asked. Are we rolling?" "It was dark," someone said. "I've been in the dark." "Yes, dark," another chimed in. "But who are you? Why were you there?" Finally, the security guard rose out of water, brushing his hair out of his eyes as he joined the crowd. "I'm Dawn," he said. "No, I'm Dawn," another said. They were looking back at one another, one by one, all saying the same thing, all using the same tone of voice, the same accent, the same body language. "I'm Dawn." For all intents and purposes, and to the best of their knowledge, they all seemed to think the same thing, that they were all, each and every one of them, Dawn Anderson. They tried convincing one another. They were comparing childhood memories, their social security number, favorite songs and food, intimate secrets about everything from their sex life to the name they would give their firstborn child. As the questions piled on, and the answers got louder, I could tell they were getting agitated. I got up and tried talking to them, but it was useless. They were all convinced that they, alone, were the real Dawn. Then someone threw a punch. Someone was getting choked. It happened so fast that I didn't even realize what was happening. They were going to kill each other. I have this vivid memory of looking back at Winona, an assistant sound technician, as she started beating Chuck Helcom with a rock, all the while screaming, in the same accent as the rest of them, that her name was Dawn Anderson. I tried breaking it up, but it was escalating all over. I was pushing two people apart when someone grabbed me from behind, dragging me down into the pool of water. I flopped down belly first. Now, I'm not sure exactly what I saw under the surface. There was a hole leading further down, just like Seb had said, and somewhere down there, I could see someone still, someone tied up with a spare cable and lodged deep into an underwater crevice. I could feel something in the water, something tugging at the back of my mind ever so slightly, a voice whispering from across a great distance, asking me, then telling me that I wasn't alone, that there was someone out there who wanted to be with me. They needed a place to stay. I didn't listen. Had it been minutes earlier, I might have. Nowadays, decades later, I still have this image in my head. Perfect hair bobbing up and down with the shifting of the pool. A person turned problem, brushed under the carpet. But at that time, I convinced myself that I was looking at nothing, that I heard nothing. I couldn't bring myself to imagine the worst. Not then, not there. There was blood in the water, screams, attacks got more ruthless. Some of them wrestled or threw rocks. Most of them tried to drown one another. "Say it," one of the hairdressers demanded. "Say it. Say that I'm Dawn." She got clocked in the back of the head and collapsed face first into the shallow end of the pool. There was this guy, Michael. He was one of our drivers, one of the calmest, friendliest people on set. I hadn't even seen him without his oversized glasses before. He could be a bit long-winded because of his stammer. Now he was standing next to me, panting like an animal, and grabbing my arm. You can't be Dawn," he wheezed. "No one can. He said I was. I listened, and you didn't. Mike, you can't." As soon as I mentioned his name, I realized I'd made a mistake. He shrieked and tried to bend my arm, an effort to break it. I managed to get a kick in on his leg, causing him to fall forward. In the split second where his grip faltered, I recoiled. I hurried out of the pool, heading straight for the exit. There were threats all around me. These familiar faces turned feral, all looking to take me down in this mad free-for-all. Stiff fingers grabbing at my hair, rocks whizzing past my ear, desperate cries. I had no choice but to run. I got out, but I hadn't been smart about it. It was hard being smart when I could barely think a cohesive thought. The moment I sucked in the night air, I realized they were coming after me. Not all of them, but at least 3. I'd never run. One of them laughed. "You are not the real me. You're a fraud." The keys to the cars were in the discarded clothes inside the cave. All I could do was run straight into the birch forest and hope for the best. I could barely think straight, and the oppressive dark didn't help. A harsh wind cut through the leaves. leaving the sweat on my brow cold as ice. They were hot on my trail, running without abandon over every sharp rock and branch and straight through the underbrush. If I were to have any chance of outpacing them, I had to stop thinking and just go for it. I almost sprained my ankle stumbling over a log. In that quiet heartbeat where I struggled to regain my balance, I could hear them. Their agitation had reached the point where they weren't just angry, they were reduced to making noises, sobbing, retching, and grunting like animals, their minds unraveling. At some point I realized I had no idea where I was. It was the middle of the birch woods, and I could still hear them skulking about. I just couldn't see them. The canopy was blocking what little moonlight was up there. I hid behind a boulder, trying to make myself small. From there, I listened. "It's dark," one of them mumbled. "Deep, deep inside. It's dark. It shouldn't be. Why is it dark?" I can't. I can't let. Can't let. I'm the real one. The really real one. You have to believe. I. They spread out. Two of them started fighting, but the third one was heading my way. A woman in her late 30s. I think she was in the props department. She'd found this sharp piece of granite that she held like a knife. Even at a distance and with little light, I could see that she clung to that rock hard enough to cut into her fingers. "Please," she wheezed. "Please let me be it. Let it be me. I can't just let, can't let." I closed my eyes, held my breath, and hoped she'd just pass me by. I counted the seconds, feeling the sting of salty sweat in my eyes. Slowly I peeked an eye open. She was right there, looking down at me. For a hot second I thought we were good. She looked hesitant. Still, I could hear the blood dripping from her grip of the stone, tapping against the leaves in the underbrush. But like an animal, something set her off. Could have been the blink of an eye, a split impulse, anything, but she threw herself at me, her hands bloodied and frantic, her nails digging into my skin, her teeth snapping at me like a hungry dog. We wrestled back and forth for what felt like forever. I didn't want to hurt her. I tried to tell her to stop, to step back, to listen, but she wouldn't. Maybe she couldn't. I felt the stab of that granite shard against my rib, and something just took over in me. I don't want to go into detail, but I fought back as hard as I could. I had to defend myself, and to do that, I couldn't hold back. None of us really wanted that fight, but we still had to do it. And when she finally stopped moving, I started walking. I didn't care. I couldn't allow myself to. I ended up by the main road leading out of Chatter Blinds. I tried to wave down a passing car, but they just kept going. Two others passed shortly after. One even slowed down, looked at me, and then passed. But one of them finally stopped. The squad car from earlier, the sheriff, and the deputy. I was taken in and looked over. Most wounds were superficial cuts and bruises. I had splotches of blood on my clothes, but it wasn't mine. I didn't say that, though. I told them there were people who needed help. I tried to explain that there'd been a fight, but I had a hard time wrapping my head around what had exactly happened and how. I think they were on drugs. I lied. It was the best explanation I could come up with. I didn't know where to even start. And this one they'd definitely believe without a second thought. The night resulted in 6 people being committed to a nearby hospital. 4 others were reported missing, one of which was the woman I'd been attacked by. The final two were in good enough condition to be taken in for interrogation. Of course, they had nothing to say, and come morning, they had no memory of what had happened. They weren't Dawn, they never had been. How could they be? No one was pressing charges, and no one had a good explanation. They didn't find any drugs, and we hadn't even had that much to drink. To an outsider, it was just weird. But at that point, our entire set seemed cursed to the people of Chatterblinds. We were the strange outsiders, coming there to upset their order. Still, 4 people were missing. They were never found. By early morning I was released. I was ready to go home. I'd had enough of that madness, and no pay in the world was enough to compensate for whatever BS was happening behind the scenes. I put on a fresh set of clothes and had my bags packed and ready to go. I was waiting for Seb to wake up, and I'd ask him to take me to the closest train station, or bus station, or whatever came first. But as I sat there, watching the sun rise, another face came wandering across the lot. Dawn, or whoever was posing as her. She wandered to me and smiled. She didn't say anything, and neither did I. She took a flower out of her hair, a tiny blue sunflower, and handed it to me. "I had a dream about you last night," she smiled, "but it wasn't a very good one." "Sorry to hear that." "You look like you had a rough night." She frowned. "Just like in my dream." "Sure." I wasn't interested. I just wanted to go home, but she leaned down and looked me in the eyes. "You beat me with a rock," she said, her face deadpan. "It hurts." "I didn't." "You didn't?" "I didn't." She shook her head. She got up and grinned at me, the kind of menacing grin that told a story in and of itself. "I'm telling," she smiled, "and you'll be in trouble." I shook my head and said nothing, but as she walked away, there was this icy cold panic in my chest. I got up and tried to find the right words. I could see where she was heading, straight for the director's trailer. I raised my hand towards her, but before I could say anything, she just grinned back at me. "It's okay," she said. "Just make the movie. It's important." She wandered away, her blue sundress swaying in the softening wind. I don't know how long I slept. A few hours, maybe, just leaning against the outer mess hall wall. It wasn't until Seb tapped me with his muddy boot that I woke up. Despite my fresh set of clothes, he could see that I wasn't okay. "You need something?" he asked, squinting from the morning sun. I considered it. I could still get on a train and just go. I could. But there was something that told me I'd regret it, if Dawn Anderson had something to say about it. She knew. Somehow, she knew. I shook my head, trying to collect my thoughts. "Maybe," I sighed. "I don't know." "Well, wait until you figure it out. We got work to do," he continued. "Everyone's on extra cleaning duty for the next set." "Great," I sighed. "Just great." I stayed down, rolling the little blue sunflower between my fingers. Seb took a moment to look me over. He must have realized I wasn't telling the whole story and offered me a hand. "Come on, buddy," he smiled. "Let's make a movie." The next couple of days, we managed to shoot a few scenes. It almost felt like a real movie set, for once. Our schedules were on time, and there was a steady stream of supporting actors being brought in. If this was the only period of filming you'd seen, you might think it was like any other project. But for those of us in the know, we knew most of this was all surface. Like the lead actress, no matter what she sounded like, or moved like, or looked like, we all knew the truth. That wasn't Dawn Anderson. But what were we supposed to do? Everyone was just acting like nothing had happened. Even Seb didn't seem to know how to act, and he was the only person in there that I could 100% trust. I'd managed to compartmentalize much of what had happened those first few days, treating it as if something that had happened to someone else. But as with many other things, normalcy came and went like a pendulum, and it was about to swing pretty far in the other direction. In the script, the next location was just called a blue house. The house itself was supposed to be insignificant. The focus of the scene was the action of the characters. It was supposed to be this really tense scene where the heroine had found a large wooden chest, rumored to contain the bones of an unholy prophet, sort of like an anti-saint. The house itself was supposed to be a sort of backdrop, just a blue house. She would slowly approach, walking from room to room, speaking to the spirit of the prophet in a dead language. Finally, the chest was supposed to slowly open. That was the planned scene. We had an actual house for this scene, down by the coast. Director Hampton wanted a real house with a view of the coastline. However, when Seb and I were brought on to set up the interior lighting, we could tell there were issues. Constant delays, where runners and set designers had to fix and tinker with the interior. Half the day passed and we hadn't put up a single light. Seb wasn't impressed. Things had been going well for a few days, and this just ground his enthusiasm to a halt. We spent most of the afternoon sitting by the cliffside, listening to music, and sharing a pack of cigarettes. That's the clearest picture I have in my mind from that day. "I gotta ask," I remember saying, "why are you so eager to keep this job?" Seb flicked the ash of his cigarette, nodding to himself. Finally, he shrugged at me. "Got a kid on the way," he said. "This is probably the last set I can work out of state before I get locked down." "You're having a kid?" "Yeah." That was the first time I imagined Seb Digman as a parent. It changed him somehow. By nightfall, they gave up. The director had a long chat with some of his inner circle and sent most people home. The only ones who were allowed to stick around were those who the director deemed trustworthy. Both Seb and I were in. Maybe it wasn't so much a matter of trust as it was desperation. As we saw wave after wave of people leaving the set, the shadows grew longer. Seb and I watched as some of the folks who'd been toiling for hours finally got to rest, and we were tasked to pick up their slack. We'd seen people wander in and out of the house all day with these cheap metal buckets, armed with little hammers that we used to nail down power cables. You don't want a loose cable to drift into view on set. That was pretty much all the equipment they'd used. It was strange. All they did was walk in, hammer a little, and come out with a bucket full of white pebbles. Then they'd toss it over the edge of the cliffside, go back in, and do it all over again. They looked like miners, only without the pickaxes and safety helmets. I'd just finished eating a prepackaged cheese and ham sandwich when I got a tap on my shoulder. One of the sound guys handed me his bucket and hammer, wiping the sweat off his brow. "You're up," he wheezed. "Go see Hampton." So I did. The director, Roy Hampton, had been busy all day. It was rare to see him do anything but make loud demands, or point out details that needed to be changed. Now he was just sitting there, on a bench across from the house, flipping through a copy of the script with a marker pen. The lead actress was nowhere to be seen. As I approached, he looked me up and down before turning his attention back to the script. "Did they tell you what to do?" he asked. "No. We need to clear the house," he continued, "for the shoot." "Clear it of what?" Without looking up, he tapped the side of my bucket. "Teeth." I was given a few more instructions for clarification. For example, I wasn't allowed to touch or move the wooden chest prop. Furthermore, I had to look everywhere, behind the furniture, under the carpets, anywhere and everywhere. I was to use the hammer and not pull them out with my hands. I could not keep any of the teeth. Once they were out of the wall, however, it was fine to touch them if necessary. But it didn't make sense to me. Obviously, teeth was a joke, but that didn't answer what those white pebbles were, and having them thrown out by the bucket load meant there had to be tons of them inside. Why did we pick that location to begin with? It was me, Seb, and 2 runners. Who stepped in? An old house made sometime in the 1920s. Tight corridors, thin wooden walls, creaky floors, curled blue wallpaper. Seb insisted that the whole house was tilting slightly, but I couldn't feel it. Wouldn't surprise me if it did, though. Stepping into the living room, there was only one item that looked out of place. A massive wooden box, smack dab in the middle of the floor. It was as if everything in the room had been moved to accommodate for that one box. I thought the team had done a great job making it. It really looked like some old ceremonial thing. It seemed to be nailed to the floor. Seb wasn't convinced, though. He leaned down, dragging his hand along the side of the box. He looked up at me with blackened fingertips. His expression changed. "This is real patina," he said. "This thing is old. Real kind of old." One of the runners were the first to find something. He called us over. It was underneath the kitchen sink. He lit it up with a flashlight, inviting us to take a look for ourselves. The others kneeled, one by one. No one said a thing. Finally, it was my turn. Even then, I was still expecting some kind of salt or calcium buildup, something you might see in an old house. But it was teeth. Actual teeth. Just like we'd been told. It was molars. Most of them small, like the nail of a pinky finger. Others were the size of a thumb. There was at least 24 of them. There was this stunned silence as we all tried to process this. For some reason my eyes drifted back to Seb. He was the only one looking not at the teeth, but at the box in the middle of the room. Noticing me looking at him, he nodded towards it. "You know," he said, "I'm starting to think that ain't a prop." There were 2 floors in total. We could find teeth in every single room, if we looked close enough. Inside the fireplace on the bottom floor, on the side of the stairs, under and on the carpets, Seb found a couple teeth hanging from the chandelier. The first tooth I knocked out was one of the most visceral things I've ever felt. There was like a wet, flesh-textured hole left in the wall that slowly closed. There was a warmth and a wetness to every single tooth, as if someone was breathing into my face with every tooth removed. Every clink of a tooth falling into my metal bucket sent a shiver down my spine. We probably went at it for an hour before we'd filled our first bucket. One by one we went outside, dumping it all over the edge of the cliff. Looking over at the director, he didn't seem to have a care in the world, laughing it up with some of the folks from the costume department. Going back in, we had trouble finding more teeth. It wasn't until about 15 minutes later when we realized that most of the places where we had already looked had new teeth growing in. Most of them tiny, but they were there, even up in the chandelier. "What's the point?" Seb sighed. "If it keeps coming back, what's the point?" "Maybe it stops," one of the runners said. "Like, after a while?" "What makes you think that?" I asked. The other runner, a guy named Merle, pulled one of the teeth out with his bare hands, stuffing it into his pocket. "I'm keeping one," he said. "Ain't no way anyone will believe me if I don't." We spent the next 3 hours knocking teeth out and throwing them over the edge of the cliff, all the while finding more teeth all over. No matter how many times we got rid of them. By the fourth bucket load, the director stopped us at the door. He went along with us inside. "It's useless," Seb tried to tell him. "There are too many." "I got it now," the director assured us. "We're fixing this." We stepped back inside and walked straight to the wooden box. Using his cigar cutter, the director cut a small wound into his thumb and smeared a bloody circle across the top of the box. The rest of us didn't say anything. This wasn't the strangest thing we'd seen him do, but it was up there. He handed me his script, now with a bloody thumbprint. "Read what's marked in yellow." Flipping through the pages, the only things marked in yellow were certain nonsense words. They were the words of the spoken off-screen entity, the corrupting influence that the heroine tries to resist throughout the movie. I can't pronounce any of this," I said. "What's this? Rio?" "You can't say it wrong," the director added. "Just say it how you feel it should be said." I looked up at Seb. He just shook his head. "Rao Soma Io," I spoke aloud. "Drin Soma Io." Ray nodded, waiting as I flipped through the pages. The marked words were few and far between, a mix of various spoken lines. "Stro Soma Io," I continued. "Hoffen Soma Io." Then something happened. The words started to make sense to me, not just the way they were supposed to be spoken, but their innate meaning. But it wasn't just words, they were experiences, pictures. They made me think of distant places and foreign smells, pictures of blue fabric blowing in the night wind, fine salt under my fingernails, a great fire. Then, without noticing, I didn't have the script in my hands anymore. The director took it back. Everyone just looked at me, slack-jawed and confused. There was a more intricate pattern on the box now, but you could barely tell. The wood was too dark, masking the dry blood. "I think we're done," Director Hampton said. "They should be gone by morning." "What? What exactly did we do?" asked Seb. "What is this?" "You think you'd understand that explanation?" He smiled. "Or would you even want to, for that matter?" Seb sighed, drawing a breath into a new cigarette. "No." The next day, filming resumed. There were no more issues with the house, and we were able to set up our equipment within the hour. We were done just after lunch, quickly moving on to some environmental shots by the cliffside. It's as if the previous day had never happened. I was pretty out of it though. I hadn't slept well. Every time I started to slip into a dream, I had this panicked feeling of not being able to get back out, like stepping off the deep end of a pool when you can't swim. I couldn't allow myself to fall into a deep sleep, instead dipping in and out of semi-consciousness until the early hours of the morning. I kept thinking about those words, seeing them, feeling them, knowing them. I remember looking out over the cliffside, feeling a stiff breeze ruffle my hair, when Seb tapped me on my shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. "Slept really bad," I sighed. "Me too," he said, sipping his coffee. Seb looked down at the rest of the crew, still packing up from one of the beach shots. They looked so small from up there. "You seen Merle today?" he asked. "The runner?" "Nah," I yawned. "Probably slept in." Seb shook his head. "No, he didn't." We were kept busy all day long, but we kept an eye out. Neither of us managed to catch a glimpse of Merle, and no one seemed to know anything. There were still people running about back at the warehouse, but most were accounted for on site. It was worrisome. I'd seen enough to know that people were expendable at this point. We came back as the sun started to set. The late night get-togethers and mini-parties had been replaced with a whole crew face-planting into their pillow simultaneously. Having lost all sleep from the other night, I was barely standing. I was out cold in a matter of minutes. This time, I could dream, but not without twisting, turning, and waking at random. I kept getting these intrusive thoughts in my head that I had to go for a run, or drink scalding hot water, or rub sand against my shin bones. Just these weird physical sensations that I had sudden urges to pursue. I didn't, of course, but I couldn't stop myself from feeling it. When my mind finally settled into a singular dream, it was surprisingly real. It felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. I imagined myself walking around the set, browsing the dark shelves, and running my hand across the cold metal. I could hear my footsteps as I made my way back to my bed, going back to sleep even there and then, in my own mind. Only when I got back, someone was already in my bed. Me. The moment I woke up, I was staring into a stranger's eyes. One green eye, one red. A rattled breath, struggling for air. It took me a moment to realize that it wasn't them having trouble breathing. It was me. I was being strangled. There was this slow buildup of panic in my chest as I came to. It was as if my heart was trying to beat faster, but the blood couldn't reach my head. Still, looking back at it, what I remember most is the neutral expression of my attacker, or the cold fingers around my neck. What I remember most is something sharp poking into my skin as if they were holding a handful of gravel and pressing it against me. I was hyper-focusing on these nonsensical little things, as if I couldn't understand what was really happening. My hand flopped to the side of the bed, my fingertips growing numb. I could feel my biceps losing strength. Grabbing something out of my bedside pants, I brought my hand up towards my attacker and flicked my thumb. I'd managed to grab my lighter. I burned them straight in their red eye. I didn't even realize how much I needed to breathe until I managed to get them off me. I pushed myself away and felt the chemicals in my body come loose, blood rushing to my head and muscles, kicking me into action. I wanted to scream for help, but all that came out was this useless whimper. My throat had been hurt. Instead, I backed away, readied myself to run, and watched my attacker step into the moonlight. Merle, the runner. His left hand was covered in teeth, going all the way up to his shoulder. More teeth falling out of his mouth with every breath. Little holes building up on the side of his face, with early onset of more teeth poking through the skin. His eye had turned red from internal bleeding, as one of the teeth had grown out of the corner of his retina. In the moment, I abandoned all reason. From what I'd seen on set, this was the most visceral and horrifying sight by far. That night with Dawn, at the cave, at least they'd been human, but this? I couldn't tell what was happening here. He shouldn't have taken that tooth. I wanted to turn to run, but he was matching my movements like a predator. A shift to the left, to the right. His eyes didn't leave me. I backed away. He moved closer. My instinct to try and talk him down was thrown out the window. This wasn't a person that would listen to reason. All I had was my lighter and a solid 8 feet of distance. I heard the tip-tap noises of little teeth falling off his arm, like sand in an hourglass. Then he attacked. My folding bed was thrown across the room. His naked footsteps were heavy, leaving dozens of teeth behind. Despite that, he was fast. He came at me with all he had. I grabbed the first thing I could use as a barrier, a door leading me into the bathroom. I rushed inside, slamming the door shut. I felt him grabbing the handle from the other side, pulling with an impossible strength, but losing his grip with the loss of teeth slipping from the palm of his hand. I got just enough leverage to lock the door. I stumbled backwards into a bathtub, pulling down the cheap blue fabric as I fell. Seconds later, the door started to give way. Wooden splinters scattered on the floor. I pulled down the shower rod, wrapped the curtain up, and set fire to it with my lighter, wielding it like a makeshift torch. Good thing it was cheap plastic, and that no one had had the time to shower that night. It felt primal, in a way, like a caveman waving off a hungry wolf, but this particular wolf didn't seem all too bothered. And with that, the door broke. It all happened so fast. I remember hearing myself trying to scream, but just managing a wheeze. I pushed the shower rod into his chest like a spear, but it barely budged him, scraping against surface-level teeth. A tooth-covered fist swung towards me, cracking the ceramic tiles next to me as he missed, instead hitting the light switch. It turned this waking nightmare into a shadow play. Vague gestures and silhouettes cast by moonlight. A red eye, a mouth with oversized teeth, tip-taps of teeth hitting ceramic tiles. And still, I couldn't scream. Managing to duck under a second swing, I used his momentum to get past and back out into the mess hall. I ran towards the back where I could pass into the warehouse, but I didn't get far. Merle threw something heavy at me, hitting me just over the shoulder. I fell forward, completely losing my balance, knocking something over from the counter. He'd ripped out a piece of the sink. Landing palms first into a spilled pile of table salt, I rolled over to see Merle approaching. Parts of the shower curtain still smoldered on his shoulder. He had picked up the shower rod, wielding it like a club. He was going to beat me to death. For a moment the impressions of the day flashed before my eyes. The teeth in the walls, the cliffside chat with Seb, the nonchalant attitude of Director Hampton, and the strange words, the images that had flashed within my mind, the words that had crept into the back of my head and settled there, coloring the inside of my mind with foreign pictures. And suddenly, it started to make sense. The blue fabric, browing in the wind from an open window, that was the shower curtain. The salt under my fingernails, it was right there. But there was no great fire, only a sputtering flame on his shoulder. "It's wrong," I muttered as Merle approached. "It's wrong. There should..." The words came to me, clear, vivid, and eager. I'll never forget them. I can't. Rau soma io, drin soma io, strau soma io, hoffen soma io. By the last syllable, it was as if something in the air corrected itself. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a freak wind, but another part of me felt like the world was making something right. A sputter from the flame got caught in his hair. Something flared up by the neck of his torn shirt. In the blink of an eye, he erupted into flame. A great fire. The fire alarm screamed in my stead. I coughed on the black smoke as Merle fled outside. I could finally hear others waking up and stepping out of their trailers. But to them, all they saw was the fire. Merle was dead the moment he hit the ground. He was just a tangled mess of fabric and something to them. I drew in a deep breath of nighttime air, feeling my throat relax. Someone was asking me what was going on. Someone was screaming for help. But louder than any voice was the mere presence of Dawn Anderson, the lead actress. Standing at the edge of the fire with a robe wrapped around her, giving me a tired smile. She scooched closer, speaking just loud enough for others to hear. "Good thing you were here." She smiled. "This could have burned down the entire warehouse." I didn't answer. I just looked at her. "Looks like some props didn't make it, huh?" She continued. Now we both had dirt on one another. She knew what I'd done to her that first night outside the cave, and I knew she wasn't the real Dawn Anderson. We were at an impasse. "Looks like I deserve a raise," I wheezed. "I'm sure Mr. Hampton agrees." They held a fireside applause for me. Someone pointed out the trail of teeth left behind, as if that somehow confirmed that it was just burning props. Someone else pointed to the vague shape of a skeletal hand in the flames. Another sign of important props being lost. But both Dawn and I knew what it really was. Or rather, who it really was. But we had a movie to make. Filming progressed rapidly. Director Hampton wanted to finish up the scenes that were shot off-site first, so we could move on to interior and controlled environments. There wasn't too much hassle once we got into a routine, but it was hard to ignore what I'd seen. Whenever things were going smoothly, all I could imagine was what horrors were happening behind closed doors. There wasn't a doubt in my mind that Roy Hampton was doing more than just directing a movie, but it was hard to put into words just what I suspected. About a week passed without incident. Seb and I got a little less to do as we transitioned to finished sets, so we were occasionally tasked with clearing out off-site gear and props, going through places we'd filmed to make sure we didn't leave anything behind, or did any damage that might make the owners mad. Then we were ordered to clear out the Blue House, the place where we'd filmed lead actress Dawn Anderson, as her character conversed with an imperceptible deity, the place that had once had teeth growing out of the walls. I wasn't too enthused about the idea. Seb and I were the first on site, mostly clearing out staples left in the walls, extra cables, putting furniture back in order, that kind of thing. And of course, we were instructed not to move the wooden crate in the middle of the room. That came with the house, apparently. Last time we were there, we'd tiptoed around it like it was a landmine. It didn't take long to get through the work order. We'd barely done anything to the place, and now that there weren't any unnatural growths coming out of the woodwork, we were peachy. The two runners we had helping us out spent most of the day smoking and going through some old magazines they'd found upstairs. I got some time to sit down with Seb in his '68 Frog Eye Sprite. We drove onto the property so we could look out over the cliffside while he blasted some Hendrix. I still had a hard time picturing him as a family man, given our last conversation. About the, kid. Was it planned? I asked. Kinda, nodded Seb. Always wanted kids. Really? I smiled. You don't seem like the type. Dreamt about it since I was a teenager. Gonna have 2 boys. John and Keith. Got it all figured out, huh? A man's gotta have a plan. Then, what if it's a girl? God already promised me. He smiled. God ain't got no reason to change their mind. We stayed there for about an hour. I leaned back and napped in the passenger seat while Seb turned up the volume on All Along the Watchtower. If that had been the rest of the shoot, I would have been okay with it. Some work, some rest, no nightmares. As we went inside to finish up, we noticed the 2 runners standing on each side of the wooden crate. They were trying to lift it. I didn't realize it at first, but they must have forgotten that we weren't supposed to move it, that it came with the house. But before me or Seb got the chance to say anything, it was already too late. See, the front of the crate had been nailed to the floor, but the back was nailed to a rotting plank. So when the runners lifted it straight up, it tilted forward and broke wide open. Apparently, it wasn't as sturdy as one would have thought. As the top of the crate burst open, I was expecting a little dust, some books, or maybe some clothes. Old doodads that had been kept around for good measure. Instead, rolling out of the wooden splinters was this big lump of stone-like mass. At first I didn't know what it was. It was large and gray like a polished lump of coal. There were also little white things crawling across it. Dozens of moths took flight out of the bottom of the crate. Then I saw it, a familiar shape bent in an unfamiliar way. This lump of coal had once been a person. The faint outline of the skull and shoulders were the most immediate giveaway, but after a while I could spot the fingers as well, broken and bent in every which way. One leg in a fetal position, another bent sideways across the body in an unnatural angle, like someone had done their best to push them into the crate, no matter how much damage was done to the body. And the moths. While a dozen or so happily fluttered about the room, I could count hundreds of maggots crawling across the body. It was almost like a pattern, zigzagging across the bends of broken bones and twisted face muscles. We all just stared at it for a moment. One of the runners poked it with his foot, tipping it slightly. It was hard as a stone. As it rocked back and forth, some of the maggots tumbled onto the floor. Seb bent down, looking at it closely. The other runner, a guy in his early 50s with a sizable gut, crossed his arms and scoffed. "It's gotta be prep," he said. "Put it back in the box." "I ain't touching it," said the other runner. "It's probably diseased." "If it was a prop, they would have asked us to bring it in," said Seb. "But they did though," said the first runner. "They asked us to." "No, they didn't," I added. "This came with the house." "BS." Well, they tried their best not to show it. I could tell the runners were just as shaken as we were. They wrapped their hands in towels before they dared to touch it, and even then, they decided to just tilt the box back up and leave it as is. As we wrapped up for the day, the runners took off, heading into town to get a sandwich. Seb and I drove off too, but stopped about halfway back to the set. Seb pulled over and parked by the side of the road, turning down the radio. He shook his head as if trying to convince himself to say something. Finally, he sighed. "We gotta call the police," he said. "We can't pretend this is normal." "You think it wasn't a prop? With everything you've seen here, do you honestly think that wasn't real?" The answer was obvious. We took a detour through town, stopping at a payphone outside the supermarket. We got a few side eyes from the locals, looking us up and down as Seb talked to the sheriff over the phone. I saw one woman leaving with her 7-year-old daughter. The kid waved at me with a little hello, and I waved back, only to see the mother pulling her away. Maybe they didn't like outsiders. Or maybe they just didn't like us. I also couldn't help but notice how there was a clothing store just across the street selling shirts, dress jackets, and coats. Very similar to the clothes to what we'd seen hung from trees outside our set. As a threat, a handful of blank-faced mannequins proudly displayed a variety of neatly pressed shirts. I started to get the idea that not only were we seen as outsiders, but as an actual threat. And given what I'd seen over the past couple of weeks, I wasn't sure they were wrong. Seb tapped me on the shoulder, snapping me out of my spiraling paranoia. "We're meeting them back at the house," he said. "Let's go." As we got back in the car, I noticed the mother staring at us from across the street, firmly clutching a golden cross around her neck. Our eyes met for a moment. I could tell she was scared. I saw her shoulders move with her heavy breathing. We weren't just outsiders to her. We were dangerous. As we drove off, I could still see her looking at us through the rear view mirror. A stark reminder that no matter who we were and what we were doing here, we weren't welcome in Chatterblinds. We pulled up outside the blue house again. We didn't have to wait long for the sheriff to arrive. I got the impression that they'd been called out a lot these past few days. There'd been the break-in, the debacle at the cave, and now this. And that was just the immediate issues. Who knew what else had been going on? They pulled up to the house, and we escorted them inside. All the while, they kept talking to one another. "Yeah, this house is derelict," the deputy said. "I'm not sure you're allowed to film here." "They got the lease," the sheriff added. "I don't like it, but it's above board. They know the owner." "Yeah, but it is what it is." As we entered the living room, Seb pointed them to the wooden crate. Moths were still fluttering about, forcing the deputy to wave them off with his hat. As they moved the loosely added lid of the crate, a few more moths fluttered out, and the body was gone. "What am I missing here?" the sheriff asked. Seb just shook his head and looked at me. Maybe the runners moved it, or the director. Either way, someone got back there ahead of us. Probably someone from the closed set, as that was closer than downtown Chatterblinds. "Someone took it," I said. "It was there and—" "Look, I'm inclined to believe you gentlemen, but you ain't got something to show us. There ain't much we can do." "We'll call you as soon as something shows up." "See that you do," he continued, "and make sure no one moves it next time." They wandered off, leaving me and Seb along with the moth-laden box and a whole bunch of nothing. The sun turned the horizon a brownish orange, stretching out our shadows. Seb didn't say a word. We got back in the car and just drove. As we came to a fork in the road, leading us up towards the closed set, Seb kept driving straight through. We missed the exit. "Where are we going?" I asked. "We're getting out of here." "Oh yeah?" "Yeah." We went past the half-abandoned farmlands, the lone houses overlooking the cliffside, and the various abandoned summer homes. Past the cows grazing on dry grass and the pine trees struggling to keep their needles, the shadows grew longer. "Why now?" I asked. "After all this, why now?" "You remember what the script said?" Seb asked. "What it said about the box?" "Not really." "Check the glove box. Got a copy. Page 36. I clicked it open and pulled out in a noted version of an older script. Turning to the correct page, I got a stark reminder of what the script said. According to the script, that box contained the priest, or prophet, of some kind of unnamed deity. It was described as the voice of the dead-tongued god. Jesus. The word just fell out of me. Looking back up at Seb, I was afraid to ask what he thought. I didn't say a word, but he answered anyway. "That crate was never supposed to be opened. It's not a prop. At best, we're looking at a mummified corpse. At worst..." He shook his head, drawing a breath of his cigarette. "I don't want to think about it," he sighed. "That's where I draw the line." "A man's gotta have a plan," I added. Seb nodded, flicking the cigarette to the road behind us. We kept going through downtown Chatterblinds and out past the highway, but as we got to a crossroads, Seb slowed down. A cold wind blew through the pine trees. I had barely noticed the dark creeping up on us. as the shadows had melted into night. As the car came to a stop, I could see something come into view. It vaguely resembled someone in a blue dress, lying halfway across the road, unmoving. "What is that?" Seb asked. Is that a person?" "I can't tell," I said. "Kinda looks like it." We sat there for a few seconds just to see if it moved. It didn't. Seb put the car into park. "I don't like this," he muttered. "I really don't." I nodded. I didn't like it either. Still, we both stepped out to make sure they were okay. As we got closer, the blue dress got tangled in a stiff breeze. At this distance, I couldn't tell for sure if it was a person, but it was roughly the size of one. Still, it didn't move, and I couldn't tell what was up or down. There was a strange pale color to it. As we got closer, it became apparent that this wasn't, in fact, a person. It was just a mannequin in a blue dress, the same kind of blank-faced mannequin I'd seen in the window of that place downtown, the one with the fancy shirts. Seb and I looked at one another as we turned back towards the car. There was someone there. They must have waited by the roadside. 8 people in total, some coming out of the woods, 2 of them blocking our way back to the car. One man leaning against the driver's side of Seb's car had a shotgun firmly pointed in our direction. On the opposite side of the car was a familiar face. It was the same woman I'd seen that first night. It was impossible to miss her stringy rose blonde hair and wiry frame. She held a hammer in her left hand, and what looked like a handful of nails in her right. Other shapes were joining her from the sides, stepping out from the edge of the forest and into the headlights of the car, all with neatly pressed white shirts, black leather belts, and dress pants. We were surrounded. "Should have left while you still could," she smiled. "Now the train's passed. Sin's already stained you." "We don't want to cause trouble," Seb said. "I'm heading home. I got a kid and—" "You got kin? Waiting at home?" She laughed. "You poor sod. You don't see it, do you? You can't feel the taint of those people curdling your bloodline." Seb didn't answer. He looked at me as if expecting an answer or a plan, but I had nothing. Hearing those hellish incantations, stepping into Satan's church, you've crossed the bridge and paid with the blood of your firstborn. You mark my words, sinner. "Then we'd like to repent," I said. "Yeah, we didn't know what to—" "Ignorance is not innocence." Seb dropped to the ground. He'd been smacked in the back of the knees with a lead pipe. Another man was heading my way with the aluminum bat, ready to do the same to me. I just held my hands up in surrender and got down on my knees. He gave me a firm push, but I was spared any further battery. "On all fours, sinner," he spat. I did as they asked. Digging my fingers into the asphalt, I could feel the road salt stinging the skin under my fingernails. I could hear Seb groan off to the side. He probably took a greater hit than I first thought. The circle closed in around us. A fist grabbed my hair, keeping my head firmly affixed to the ground. I could barely see Seb in my periphery. "Ariel," said the man with the shotgun. "We ought to step off the road." "This won't be long," the woman smiled. "And I don't think anyone on these roads mind waiting for a good cause." It was the first time I heard her name, and all these years later, it still burned into my mind. Ariel. It sends me back to that moment, staring down at the asphalt, feeling that cold breeze on my back. Ariel got down on her knees in front of me, carefully putting her hand on my cheek. She was warm and trembling. She was excited. "You got any offspring?" she asked. "No," I gasped. "No, I don't." She patted me on the cheek. "Good. Then your tainted blood can die with you. Very good." "I don't want to die." "We don't always get what we want, son." She moved over to Seb. I could hear her get down on her knees. "I'm gonna need an address," she said. "I ain't giving you anything," Seb spat. "Nothing." "We're doing you a kindness," Ariel explained. "This is not about killing people. This is about stopping Satan in his tracks. We're putting out a fire that could burn down the world, son." "My boy ain't gonna hurt anyone." "What's your boy's name?" There was a short pause as Seb considered his options. I could hear him get a firm slap as she repeated the question. "Your boy's name, son." "John." "Well, let me tell you how this is gonna go. With the company you keep and the taint you carry in your soul, John is gonna live a life of pain and sin, barred from the gates of heaven to wander in perpetuity. The empty halls of the forgotten. You want that for your kin?" There was no answer. Ariel sighed, exasperated. "Screw it," she said. "We got what we came for. Let's not drag it out." They pulled us to our feet and pushed us towards the tree line. They turned off Seb's car and moved the mannequin off the road. I was ready to scream for help at the first sign of a passing car, but no one came. Turns out that road wasn't quite as popular as one might think. I could hear the jingle of nails in Ariel's hand. I could see 2 men with rope near the tree line, and 2 more lighting the way with flashlights. They led us there without a word, but with a soft hum on their lips. A hymn. There's nothing wrong with us," Seb said, desperately trying to bargain. "We were leaving. We were getting out." "An infection spreads," said Ariel, "as is the nature of things." "We're not an infection," Seb growled. "We're people. I have folks waiting for me at home. "I understand," she interrupted. "I hear you, and I'm sorry." There was something so nonchalant about her way of saying this, but the implications of what was about to happen was starting to dawn on me. I could feel my heart racing, trying to catch up with my thoughts. These people weren't just here to frighten us, or to make us uncomfortable. They were here to make examples of us, for the others. With every hand that touched me, I recoiled. I protested, but there were too many of them. I was pushed up with my back against a tree, and before I could say anything, a rope was pulled over my neck and tied by the back of the trunk. Shortly after, my hands were bound. Ariel stepped back, handing the hammer and nails to one of her associates. She clutched her hands in front of her and closed her eyes. The 2 flashlights were firmly affixed on us. I could feel myself sweating through my clothes, staining my armpits. "It is my firm belief that you are beyond redemption," she said. "But it is by God's words that we aim to forgive and redeem. So by these words, I pray you find salvation." They moved up to Seb first. They were going to nail him to that tree. "O Heavenly Father, hallowed be thy name." As Ariel began her prayer, Seb turned to me. I could see the panic in his eyes as they loosened the rope from his left hand and moved it up to the side of the trunk. "Think of the script," he said. Taint them. Say something. His eyes flickered wildly, like a frightened animal. His tone was conversational, but it was fear. He didn't dare to scream. It's as if keeping his voice normal would somehow deter them from treating us like animals. What are you? A firm tap of a hammer, followed by a horrifying shriek of pain, suddenly cut short by someone pulling back on the rope, pressing against his neck. I could see Seb's face turn purple as his scream got stuck in the back of his throat. My mind raced as I tried to think of what he could mean. I had read the script, but it was all just fiction. There were parts that were unsettling, but that was natural for a horror movie. But I couldn't help but to think back on the words that the director had asked me to read that day back in the Blue House. The highlighted words, the meaning between the lines, the images they'd painted in my mind. Looking at Seb's bloated face, hesitantly I stuttered those words. Rao Soma Io. Drin Soma Io. The rope tightened around my neck. I couldn't speak or breathe. My head was bursting at the seams, and my mouth was drier than sand. Still, I mouthed the words to completion. Strauss Soma Io. Hoffen Soma Io. Just thinking of those words brought pictures to my mind. A blue fabric swaying in the breeze, salt under my fingernails, a great fire. That was the pattern inherent in those words. There was a truth to them, a universal truth, something that I couldn't comprehend. It occurred to me that the pattern had repeated. We'd seen the mannequin dressed in blue, and the way the dress had fluttered in the cold breeze. I'd felt the road salt grind under my fingernails, but there was no great fire. But there would be. There always would be. The words didn't lie. As they untied Seb's right hand and pushed it back against the trunk, I saw something in the distance. Far behind the men with the flashlights, there was a silhouette. Someone coming our way. Ariel opened her eyes and shuddered, stopping the reciting of her prayer. The others stopped as well and looked to her for guidance. She was furious. Whatever I'd said had cut straight through the prayers. She flipped up a pocket knife and stormed up to me. I'll rip your tongue out. It all happened in a matter of seconds, but I remember it as an eternity. I remember every detail of Ariel's sweaty forehead, and the taste of metal on my tongue, that initial cut and the single drop of blood staining her index finger. And I remember looking past her, and there, stepping into full view, was the coal-shaped figure we'd pulled out that chest earlier. Its face and limbs still twisted, struggling to move, hobbling forward like a broken puppet, neck firmly broken, leaning against a stiff shoulder, mouth wide open in a toothless, silent scream, maggots still dropping from every crack and corner. Looking back at it, I feel this deep pain in my chest, like I surrendered something of mine willingly, freely handing over my pound of flesh, but in that moment all I could think was the pattern foretold in the words I'd learned. There was going to be a great fire. I can still see it in my mind, the tips of Ariel's rose-blonde hair starting to glow, the man with the shotgun dropping everything to clutch his scalp, the men standing by our side stepping away, shielding their faces from the broken warmth. Fire. 4 of them burst into flames, illuminating the broken creature from every angle. The ill-shaped legs and arms, the inverse torso, a dead, dry tongue. Screams erupted into screeching as they fled or died. Their prayer shattered to the wind, broken by pain and panic. Ariel's pocket knife dropping to the ground as she fled like a bat out of hell. her rose blonde hair curling up to die with the encroaching flames. In a matter of seconds, all that remained was a sputtering corpse, next to a shotgun and this thing. Candle-like flames danced in the undergrowth, but quickly died out. Our attackers spread out across the woods, screaming their prayers and curses into the night. I couldn't hear them over my pounding heart. Seb had almost passed out from the pain, barely staying awake. I couldn't get him to look at me. He just hung limplessly from his maimed left hand, still nailed to the trunk of the tree. A dry hand touched the side of my head, cradling me like a worried parent. A dead face drew closer, an eyeless stare piercing into my mind. It had heard me. We spoke the same language. It was eager to see me. It spoke to me. It was only a few syllables, but it was... I can't put it into words. It was a guide, a path, a way to make it through all this and come out the other side unscathed. I can't even put to words what they sounded like, or whether it was consonants or vowels. It just was. In the blink of an eye, I understood. A surge of information burrowed into the back of my mind, promising to help me with everything going forward, if I was open to listen. To this day, I'm convinced that this single action is what has allowed me to live this long, to outlive all the others, and as that thing left me in those woods, I remember fixating on the first step on that path. I had to finish the movie. No matter what, I just had to. What happened next was a blur. I remember picking up a hammer with a soot-covered handle and bringing Seb down from that tree. I remember driving his '68 Frog Eye Sprite back to town to call for help. I remember an ambulance and a knowing nod from the sheriff's deputy. And as I returned to the set that night, I did so with a renewed determination. This wasn't just a movie anymore. This was an event foretold, something I had been bound to complete. And at that point, I didn't know if I was going to fight it with every inch of my being, or let fate take its course. In a way, I still don't know. Over the next few weeks, most of the remaining shoots went off without a hitch. Dawn, or whatever passed as Dawn, was an immaculate professional, knocking out most scenes in 1 or 2 takes. It was sort of unnerving to watch, seeing her move in and out of character at the drop of a hat, almost like she could make herself into different people. It wasn't just acting, it was different, stronger even. Seb came back after a while, but he was a completely different person. Not only because he wasn't allowed to do any heavy lifting, but because of the incident with Ariel and the white shirts. It had drained him, in a way, knocked him off his pedestal. There was no quick quips or clever initiatives. He was broken and afraid. We both just kept our heads down and wished for it all to be over. We had moved to in-house sets, leaving about a third of the support staff without a clear assignment. Not me and Seb, though. No matter where we filmed, there was always need for proper lighting. Still, we could see groups of bored staffers hanging out near the mess hall during our breaks. There was a small celebration when we hit the final milestone. I wasn't on set for it, but we all got a small bottle of champagne. Seb just chugged his. We noticed a few more smiles as people skittered from station to station. There was still a bit more filming to do, but this was the final scene with any sort of dialogue. The final days would be mostly Foley, environment shots, and reshoots, but from what we'd seen, there wouldn't be many of those. A handful, maybe. We had a small party. Most of us were just happy to be done with it. The optimism from those early days were gone. By now, we'd all figured out that there was more to this film than we'd first thought. Some talked about it being turned into more of an art film, while others more concerned about the effort spent on voiceovers. I remember overhearing a conversation between two of the camera operators. Every time we bring up an issue, it's just, they say we'll fix it in post, but no one is taking notes. No one. And some things you can't fix in post. There were a lot of rumors floating around. Some of the people in the costume department had overheard a discussion about the film's distribution. When we first started, we had been told there'd be early screenings in cinemas across 12 states, but according to more recent rumors, that plan had always been speculative. There was no set plan in place. Furthermore, there'd been a few visits from investors. As it turns out, the people who'd invested money into the movie weren't from the entertainment industry. There was a small electronics company who'd invested a significant amount, and a publishing company. There was also a pharmaceutical rep with a sort of axe insignia, who seemed to be the largest contributor, but they'd only been on set for a single day. Either way, it was becoming increasingly clear that most of the people working with director Hampton didn't seem all that interested in the movie itself. Which begged to question, if these people weren't interested in the movie, then what were they interested in? Well, I had to take over most of Seb's responsibilities on set. There wasn't much left to do. It was mostly maintenance and staying on call for possible reshoots. It gave me a lot more time on my own, talking to other crew members and staying updated on the schedule. Turns out, there'd been talks of people pre-screening a couple of scenes. The director had been showing a few scenes of the movie to some of the part-timers. It was a strange rumor. A lot of people were talking about the screening itself, but no one had anything to say about what they'd seen. The only evidence for people having been invited to it in the first place was the staff pins. Every staff member who'd attended a pre-screening were given a pin as a sort of show of trust. It became the mark of an inner circle of trustees, and people were eager to get one. It wasn't a big deal in and of itself. It was just a little blue pin in the shape of a sunflower. I wasn't too eager to see it. I just wanted to go home at that point. We were only a couple of weeks from packing up and officially calling it a day. I was looking forward to throwing my hands up and just being done with it. I wasn't that curious about the pre-screening at first, but there were questions starting to build up, mostly because of a woman named Sammy. Sammy worked with the set designers. She was one of the most outgoing people in the crew, introducing herself to people with a handshake and a hug. Very much a child of the flower power era. She was the kind of person who just exuded positivity. There was no way not to like her, really. She was one of the first people invited to the pre-screening. I wasn't surprised. She'd made a lot of friends, but it was what happened afterwards that made me raise an eyebrow. She started to zone out a lot. I'd see her eyes completely glaze over, instead of lighting up when she recognized a friendly face. Most of the time, she'd be looking down, as if deep in thought. She would also write a lot. I'd never seen her write anything, but all of a sudden she was carrying around a notebook at all hours of the day, and once I'd noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. A lot of the folks with pins had notebooks. It was strange, though. No one had said anything about it. I tried asking Sammy about it, but she was very deflecting. The Sammy I knew could be set off to talk about anything for any length of time, so to have her shut down a conversation for any reason was very out of character. "Just inventory," she said, "making sure we got it all covered." Yeah, no, I wasn't buying it. Still, we got ever closer to the final day on set. One afternoon, Seb came to see me. It was just after dinner time, and I'd horked down a couple of hot dogs. He walked up to me, flashing his very own sunflower pin. "I've been invited to a screening tonight," he said. You think I should go?" "You want to?" "I don't know," he said, shaking his head. "I don't like it." "So just don't go." "You think they'll let us?" After what we'd seen, I wasn't so sure. There was no telling what was really going on behind the curtain. "I mean, what are they gonna do?" I asked. "Do you want to find out?" Looking at Sammy's lonely corner in the mess hall and her glassy-eyed stare, I didn't know what to think. There was a part of me that just wanted answers. I think I realized, even then, that I couldn't step away from all of this without answers. The things I'd seen during the filming of The End of Eternity would haunt me for the rest of my life, so any sort of idea of what it all meant might give me some peace of mind. "I'll go," I said. "Then I'll tell you about it." "You sure?" Seb asked. "A man's gotta have a plan." Seb handed over his pin. About an hour later, I was standing outside a meeting room at the far side of the main building, along with 8 other anxious crew members. There were mixed feelings. Some seemed excited, others worried. I was somewhere in the middle. It was so strange, in a way. Even now, no one knew for sure what parts of the script would make it into the final cut. There were a couple of scenes I was fairly sure were being cut, but then again, Roy Hampton was erratic at best and nonsensical at worst. There was no way for any of us to know for sure. But yeah, I think all of us had long since realized that this would be no ordinary horror movie. One of Hampton's assistants checked out pins and led us into a small room. There were black chairs placed in 4 rows of 6. There were no lights. I got myself in the second to last row, far back enough to get a good overview, but not far enough to bring attention to myself. Others were already whispering with anticipation. Were they showing us a single clip? Several? Raw footage? Before we got a chance to ask anything, I heard the familiar click of a projector rolling to life. I hadn't noticed them rolling it in. Then again, it was a little too dark to see anything but the silver screen. All our eyes focused on that little shining square at the far end of the room. The bright light and the clicking. So, there isn't much to say about the footage shown. Honestly, I can't remember much of it. There were quick cuts, some kind of voiceover, strange music. But I have no visual memory of what was shown on screen. I just remember sitting there, mesmerized, until someone in the back row tapped me on the shoulder. "I love this part," they whispered. "You seen this?" I asked. "No, but I helped with the story." I was about to turn around, but they put a dry finger on my cheek, keeping my head looking forward. "You don't want to miss this," they said. "You a co-writer?" "We all are," they whispered. "We put words to thoughts that were always there." Sounds like something a writer would say. How appropriate. I think I missed something vital. Looking around the room, I could see others weeping and burrowing their face in their hands, but the screen was empty. There was just nothing left but the projector clicking over and over. Did I miss it? Turning around, I saw no one in the back row. Perhaps the one I'd spoken to had already left. Then again, that finger on my cheek felt familiar in a way I didn't want to think about. Perhaps it had been the same person who saved me from the white shirts. If so, I'm using the term person very loosely. I stepped out of there with no clue what the big deal was. I barely remember what I'd watched, and there was this uncomfortable ringing in my ears that just wouldn't go away. I still had the pin, and, to my surprise, I was holding a notebook. I didn't remember picking that up. Looking at the others, they seemed just as dazed as I was. Most of them awkwardly mumbled and tried to laugh it off, while others seemed genuinely disturbed. One of them kept repeating, "What was it about?" over and over like a mantra. I didn't have a good answer. No one did. If I really stopped to think, I'd get flashes of images. I'd see a woman in blue, and I'd hear this monotone droning noise slowly translating itself into a voice. It spoke, but I couldn't understand the language. But somehow, I could understand what they meant. It was fleeting, like the flavor of a childhood treat. Returning to the mess hall, Seb couldn't begin to understand what I was talking about. The more I tried to explain it, the stranger it seemed to me. He asked me question after question, but I didn't know what to say. It was uncomfortable. As in, physically uncomfortable. It made me so anxious that I felt nauseous. Rushing off to the bathroom, I tried to calm myself. I stood there looking into the mirror, making a mental list of what I'd seen. I tried to focus on a single scene, so I could write it down and show it to Seb. I clutched my notebook and pen and whispered aloud to myself. "There were branches in the foreground," I muttered, zooming past a field of flowers, a woman in blue, an overhead voice speaking in the background saying, and there it just stopped for me, saying... I looked down on my notebook, looking to jolt my thoughts back into action. I'd tried to write it all down, but all that had come out were these nonsense words, similar to what I'd read in the script previously. They didn't mean anything, and yet they resonated with me. In a way, it's hard to explain. It's terrifying at first. A voice came from a stall behind me, a tattered old voice, as dry as bone. It was drawn out, spoken as if they'd just woken up. I didn't say anything. That every word we say, and every thought we think, has already been said in thought. That it's all out there in nature. We're plucking them from trees long since grown. One of the stall doors slowly opened. What other words are out there? Can we find the thoughts of a fluttering hummingbird, of the slithering snake, and the bubbling brook? Blackened fingers wrapped around the door frame, crackling like burning tinder. What were the first thoughts of a conscious God? And when we find them, will we recognize them? The outlines of a burned, toothless face, twisted beyond recognition. Empty eye sockets, facial muscles long since decrepit. What happens when the words come to an end, when there is nothing more to say? The door flung open and I flinched. Catching a glimpse of my notebook, I noticed a single word repeated over and over. EO. Of course, I was alone in there. There was no one in the stall, just as there'd been no one sitting behind me at the screening. But that didn't mean what I'd seen and heard wasn't real. Later that night, I noticed a group of people outside the mess hall. Mostly staffers, but they were all people who had been shown the screening. I could see their pins. They'd brought their notebooks and had begun comparing notes. Some of them were ripping out pages, handing them back and forth between one another. Even Sammy was there. It looked like a spirited debate. Seb had kept his eyes on them for a while. When I joined him, he couldn't help but look down at my notebook. "They're trying to make sense of it," he said, comparing it to the script. "Are they making any progress?" I asked. "Not sure," he said, pointing at one of the director's assistants. "He's collecting some of it." "Collecting what?" "No idea." There was a part of me that wanted to go out there. I wanted to be part of it, to figure it all out, to understand, to put my thoughts into words and organize what I could. But looking at Seb and down at my nonsensical notes, I couldn't bring myself to go further than a couple of steps. What were the first thoughts of a conscious God? I mumbled to myself, repeating what I'd heard. First line of the script. I looked at Seb, raising an eyebrow. It's in Hampton's cutout of the script, he continued. First line of the movie. Did he write it? I think it's from the original author. Our discussion was cut short as a fight broke out. I was about to run outside, but Seb held me back. Instead, we stopped to watch. It was just 2 punches. Then one of the assistants hit the ground. Still holding his notebook, he nodded, writing something down. It helps, he laughed. I see it. I get it. One of the makeup artists punched 3 staples into the shoulder of a man next to her. There was another fist fight, and someone began kicking a man on the ground. Someone used a camera lens as a bludgeon, smashing it over their own head. Yes, I remember, someone cried. Of course. It's brilliant. Hampton's assistant was circling the mayhem, picking up bits and pieces of bloody notes as it escalated. I could see people from nearby trailers beelining towards the crowd, throwing themselves into chaos. Even inside the mess hall, people were pushing past me to get out there, all with the same sunflower pin, eager to make sense of their experience, to put it into words. Even Sammy got into it, this kind-hearted, soft-spoken young woman. Now she was on the muddy ground with a nail file, stabbing it into the leg of a middle-aged camera operator. Someone grabbed my arm. It was a man with short blonde hair and oversized glasses. He must have spotted my notebook. He tried to pull me along, smiling at me. I resisted. Come on, he said. We almost got it. I pulled my hand away and his smile dissipated. Seb stepped up next to me. What is wrong with you? Seb said. Does that look normal to you? He pointed out the door with his wounded hand. Equal parts relieved laughter and pain reverberated through the outer yard. I could see pinless bystanders lining up around them, looking at them from afar. But we almost got it, the man added. And it's genius. He grabbed my arm again, this time with force. I tried pulling back, but he held on tight. Before I had the time to protest, Seb socked the guy across the nose, snapping the cartilage. The man reeled back in the doorway, clutching his bleeding nose. He looked up at us with this big, unnerving smile. Seemingly without thought, he wrote something down in his notebook. He didn't even look down. Do it again, he smiled. Hit me. I stepped back and Seb followed suit. It makes so much more sense when you do. You have no idea. He hurried towards us, but we backed away. Leaving through the warehouse, we slammed a door shut in his face. Locking it from the other side, I could still hear him through the door. Do it again. Hit me. You gotta. Stepping away from the door, we could hear him starting to bash something against it. Seb turned to me, putting a hand on my shoulder. You got your head screwed on? He asked. Yeah, I think I'm good, I said. I missed some of it. You... what? How? There was someone in the back row. They... Before I finished the sentence, something moved outside. We could see it through the windows. At first I thought it was someone holding a spotlight, but as my mind processed it, I realized they were on fire. A man burning, cheerfully sprinting as far as his legs would take him. Even from afar and through the window, I could see all his teeth through a ghoulish grin. There was a gunshot and a cheer. Laughter. Someone in the other room was screaming, begging to be let go. Then a scream cut short. Another gunshot, more cheers, laughing, singing. Someone was putting on music. Seb and I looked at one another, but said nothing. Every second, there was a new horrifying sound coming from outside. I barely noticed him snatching my notebook out of my hands. Looking at the nonsensical words I'd written, he dropped it on the floor and grabbed my collar. "Don't lie to me," he said, shaking his head. "If you're part of this, you gotta tell me. You owe me." I just stood there with my mouth open, trying to put something into words. I couldn't do it. There were too many thoughts, too many threads to pull, but for all the parts of me that wanted answers, there were twice as many telling me to run. This was spiraling out of control. Seb just sighed, looking at the back exit. "My car's around the corner," he said. "Let's go." I took point, leaving through the back exit. The first thing I saw was the smoldering corpse of a burning man, still smiling. Running, we rounded the corner between two trailers. It was fast, but I can't forget what I saw that night. One of the trailer doors were open. There was a woman stabbing into a twitching corpse. "He wants this," she repeated. "I'm blameless. It's his wish." Someone leapt off the roof of the mess hall. Others happily attacked one another with various weapons and tools. I saw the man getting whipped with sound cables. Those who couldn't reach their notebooks just yelled out the words that came to mind, and it was all just nonsense. But it was the kind of nonsense that reverberated in my head, looking for meaning, and I'm sure that if I listened too closely, I'd find it. As we got to Seb's car, I could see the light from a bonfire at the front of the set. There was this awful, acrid smell in the air. I could taste the smoke on my tongue, and there was a residue that stuck to the inside of my nose. It was awful, sickening. The moment I opened the passenger side door, I looked across at Seb. Behind him there was a black silhouette, something hiding in the dark, looking my way, and with a whisper that traveled straight into my ear it said, "Duck." The moment I did, a fire axe cleaved the air inches above my scalp. I could hear the weight of the steel axe head. He was an older man from the logistics department. He kept track of the warehouse inventory. Now he was shirtless, wielding a fire axe. "I'll help you," he exclaimed. "Stand still. I'll help." Diving into the car, he came at me again. I kicked the passenger door open, breaking a handful of unseen mechanisms. It slammed into his stomach, sending him reeling back. As Seb put the car into gear, the wild eyes of the old man met mine. "Thank you," he smiled. "Thank you so much." Before he got another chance to attack, we were on our way. My breaths were so short, they were barely perceptible. The 68 Frog Eye Sprite spun around, tires screeching as we gunned for the exit. The gate would be closed, but we didn't have much choice. The bonfire was enormous. Even from the back and the side of the building, we could see the top of the fire. As we turned the corner, I could barely bring myself to look at it. I could see bodies in the fire, skeleton hands reaching upwards, people throwing themselves into a pile. Chanting, laughter, singing, and there, in the midst of it all, I could see Director Roy Hampton. He was collecting notes from the various notebooks, seemingly ignored by the mad revelers. He gave us a curious look as we sped past, clutching his many notes to his chest like a mother cradling her child. The car lurched forward as we broke through the gate. Metal and plastic rattled and scattered to the wind. Tires screeched and we were on our way. Even from afar I could still make out Roy Hampton's silhouette by the fire, and right next to him, a burned-out mockery of a person. Taking to the road, Seb didn't stop for anything. He broke every speed limit going through downtown Chatterblinds. He took a different route through the outskirts of the town, letting the suspension suffer the many potholes that had built up over the years. He wasn't taking any chances, and we were getting out, no matter what. By the time we hit the freeway, it almost felt like that first day, leaving whatever had been behind us, and heading for greater things. Him to a life as a family man, and me, well, I had plenty of time to figure something out. But well, that was our final day on set. It was far from our final day with The End of Eternity, and it wouldn't be the last time I saw director Roy Hampton. After leaving the set of The End of Eternity, Seb and I went west. We didn't stop until every sign pointing us back to Chatterblinds were far off in the rear view mirror. The highway was as open as ever, but I couldn't help but to feel trapped. Like some cosmic shackle had bound my life to what had happened back there. Even if I never saw or heard from any of them again, there was no way I'd ever forget what had happened. After an exhausting trip, Seb and I finally parted ways at a roadside diner. He was going back home to his girlfriend, and I was going to pick up my job working the projector. It wasn't much, but I needed to get back to something mundane to process it all, to come down. We had a meal and hugged it out in the parking lot. We didn't say much. I wished him the best, and he did the same. But as he got back in his car, he asked me a final question. If I hear something, do you want me to pass it on? Yeah, I nodded. Sure. I didn't really want it, but I didn't expect him to hear anything either. It was over. It was done. And for a long time, that was it. 6 years. 6 years of pretending to live a normal life, dating back and forth, showing movies to the late-night crowds, getting promoted to general manager, and handling the shifts. I ended up in brief but stormy relationship with a Dutch woman that almost had me killed. Long story, but that's what life's about. A whole bunch of long stories. 6 years after the filming of The End of Eternity, I was in a slump. The movie was never shown. Sure, I got the check in the mail, and it was substantial, but money just sort of leaks out of your account over time. It didn't take long for all that hard work and suffering to be turned into a cheap replacement car, new kitchen floors, a suit, and the various day-to-day stuff that no one really pays attention to. I was as broken and stuck as ever. My new position afforded me a slightly more flexible schedule, and a place with one more room, but that was pretty much it. It was the same job, the same people, the same movie trends bringing in the same crowds. Then, I got a call from Seb. Seb Digman was a family man by then. I hadn't heard much about it, but I got the impression that he had a troubled family life. I knew of his one kid, little John, but I think he had a second or even a third kid with another woman. Either way, he was steering dangerously close to Deadbeat Dad Road, and he'd long since taken his hands off the wheel. But talking to me was different. It was like nothing had ever happened, just two excited friends, eager to meet. He told me about coming down to town in a couple of days to sort out some family stuff, and he thought we could catch up. You said you wanted me to let you know if I got something, he said. Well, this is it. I got something. I met up with Seb at an old corner pub, the kind of place that had been around for generations. I could easily picture the folks behind the counter having been there since the Civil War. Seb was good, all things considered, a little heavier under the eyes, but still as upbeat as ever. The scar on his hand from being nailed to a tree was as obvious as ever, though. He wasn't getting rid of that anytime soon. We had a couple of beers and talked about our lives. He had a lot more to say than me, but the story about the Dutch ex-girlfriend gave him a couple laughs. But when it came to the meat of the conversation, the tone took somber turn. "I've been keeping my ears open," he said. "The movie's out there, but it's mostly shown at private parties. Small gatherings. People close to Hampton." "Like a home movie kind of thing?" "Yeah, like that," nodded Seb. "It's weird." "So what's the big news?" "Well, there's gonna be a showing pretty soon," Seb sighed. "And, it's not far. There's this up-and-coming finance guy who's expanding into the entertainment industry, and Hampton must have gotten whiff of him." "Sounds exclusive," I added. "It is," Seb agreed. "But the guy is like, 21? And his mom is, an old acquaintance of ours. We can get a foot in the door." "Through his mom? Hear me out on this." I heard him out. I didn't like it. He made an argument for it, explained how it was all set and ready to go, and finally just asked me to go, as a friend. "Can you live your life without knowing what this was all about?" he asked. And no, I couldn't. I really couldn't, not even then. The man's mother was none other than Ariel, the ringleader from that group of violent locals back from Chatter Blinds. Turns out after getting severe burns on most parts of her body, a lot of the fire in her burned out. Having turned docile, wheelchair-bound, and lethargic, Ariel had spent years trying to find a way to come to terms with her past. This was a way to do so, to see the source of her pain with her own eyes, and to apologize for her past misgivings. This had turned into a sort of enemy of an enemy kind of deal. Ariel had long since realized that her problem wasn't with us, but with the various powers that be that pushed that whole film into the realm of the senseless. After a long discussion, she and Seb had agreed to put their differences aside. She would get him a couple of invitations for the screening, and in return, he'd grant her the peace of mind that only forgiveness could bring. I wasn't buying it. I'd seen that woman's eyes, and I couldn't imagine anything but hate coming from them. But then again, last time I'd seen her, she'd almost been burned alive. That changes people. On the day of the screening, Seb picked me up in his '68 Frog Eye Sprite. We had a couple of Slim Jims as a dinner snack. I could tell Seb was nervous, but it was impossible to say exactly why. Maybe he was excited to leave this chapter of his life behind once and for all. Or maybe it was something else. Either way, I could tell something was off. He barely said a word on the drive up, keeping his eyes on the road and his breathing steady. But he did say one thing that made me raise an eyebrow. "There's a storm on Jupiter," he said. "Sorry, what?" "There's a storm on Jupiter," he repeated. "Read it in a magazine once. It's been around for centuries. Kinda looks like a big eye." "Didn't know that." "You can sort of see it from Earth," he continued, "with a large, white disk, and it's all storm." "Where are you going with this?" "I don't know," he sighed. "It's just, some things are like that, you know? Without that storm, without that big eye in the sky, we wouldn't see it." Looking at the road ahead, I could feel the first pitter-patter of rain. "If it wasn't for all that storm and noise, we might not even know it was there," he continued. "Makes me wonder what kind of things are out there, flying under the radar, you know? All the things without storms, that just kinda stay in the dark." He turned to me as he clicked on the wipers. "I'm not sure we're seeing the real storm yet," he sighed. I don't think this is it." We parked about a block from the venue. By now, the rain was coming down hard. Seb had to pull a tarp over his car, costing us a couple of minutes in the downpour. By the time we got to our meetup, we were both drenched, But our host wasn't. We met Ariel outside a cafe, along with her son, Jonah. I could barely recognize her. Most of her face was burned, and her left eye had sunken in on itself. Looking at it felt like falling into a well. She didn't even look up at us when we approached, instead just holding a cross around her neck with both of her shaking hands. We sat down with her. Jonah went to get us a couple of coffees, leaving us to stir in our own silence. It probably took Seb a solid minute to find the right words. "This won't set things right," he finally said, "but it's a start." Looking up at him with that one dark eye and the other as bright as ever, Ariel nodded. "I understand." "You tried to have us killed," I said. She turned to me, her face barely moving. Not a single wrinkle of expression changed. "Yes." There wasn't much more to say. We had history. We were all on our own paths, for our own reasons. But maybe this was meant to be something else, and maybe for that moment we all realized it. Either way, we were in this together. We trudged through the rain, making our way to a rented-out community theater, our venue for the night. Jonah tried to keep the mood up by talking about his upcoming investment, while Seb and I chimed in with what applicable movie trivia we could conjure up to keep him interested. While I was still a hobbyist at best, Seb hadn't slowed down in the least. He could step back into his role at the drop of a hat. We were among the first to arrive. There was a check-in at the door, where we were written down as guests. The place was buzzing with caterers and security personnel. There were a few other guests who'd arrived early, casually socializing in the lobby. Jonah excused himself, bringing his mother along to meet his many potential clients and business partners. As Ariel was rolled away, she turned to us, and for the first time I could sense something, the hint of a smile. Within the next hour or so, the place was crowded. All kinds of people from the movie industry, along with one or two hopeful singers/songwriters. There was a composer who'd worked with Kubrick for a brief time, taking up plenty of spotlight. 3 B-list actors, trying to talk their way into a handshake and a couple of promises. This one news anchor from upstate, a photographer, along with his girlfriend of the week. It was a wild mix. Some seemed desperate to just get an in on whatever this was supposed to be, while others seemed to be there out of genuine interest for Hampton and his work. Then, of course, some people just wanted to skim some money off of Jonah. Seb and I kept to ourselves. We were asked a couple of times who we were, but we kept the discussions short. We just said we'd worked on the movie, mostly background technical stuff. Seb tried to divert attention by making people talk about themselves, a strategy that worked 9 times out of 10. There was a little announcement jingle, the same that we used at my job. The movie was about to start. We got seats behind Jonah and Ariel. Even with all the guests invited, there weren't even enough people to fill a quarter of the seats. It was eerie, in a way, like we were doing something inherently wrong. A few caterers walked up and down the rows, offering shrimp cocktails and cheap sipping drinks. Seb bunkered up with a couple, getting a few eye rolls in return. Looking at me, he shrugged. "I drove here," he whispered. "You're driving back." "The man with the plan," I sighed. As the lights dimmed, there was a faint scatter of applause coming from the other side of the room, as none other than director Roy Hampton stepped out on stage. He waved at the audience as he introduced himself. "I'm Roy Hampton, director of End of Eternity," he presented. "This exclusive viewing is made as a benefit for our rising entertainment star and benefactor. Let him see you, Jonah. Don't be shy." Jonah got out of his seat, waving to the others. He sat back down with a smile, looking at his mother. Ariel didn't move a muscle. It's been a long journey. We've presented screenings of this movie in select theaters across the country, but as you're about to experience, it's not a project intended for the mainstream. This was a passion project, something deep and meaningful to me, and the many people who've worked on it. I believe it can give us a glimpse of something deeper, and in a way, to make us whole. He took a deep breath, looked down and back up. So without further ado, I present to you The End of Eternity. Thank you. I could see Seb tense up in the light of the silver screen. This was it. This was the movie. The End of Eternity. Sitting here decades later, it's hard to describe. As I watched, I kept having to remind myself what I was doing. I kept spacing in and out of focus. It was as if the movie continued to run inside my head. Even when I closed my eyes, still there was a narrative. I'll try to explain it. The movie portrayed an anonymous woman in a blue dress. She was tortured by the voice of an otherworldly being, whispering secrets of the world to her, as she tried to get a job in a new town, escaping a passionless marriage. She eventually succumbs to the influence. Turning more and more inward, she finally understands her place in the world. In the movie, the Earth exists in a multitude of fractured realities. In one world, people wander as broken shadows, desperately seeking to become whole. In another, they are tortured beasts, floating in a hellish firescape. But in countless iterations of the universe, all existing simultaneously, the protagonist is the one who solely lives here. In this one instance, this one life, this one place. She is the first of the last, an indication of the many worlds dying, disappearing, an indication that whatever waits at the end of eternity is waking, an impossible force deep within the crust of the soil, stirring, cracking her world open like an egg. So it speaks to her. The voice at the end of it all, the final spoken word, and the penultimate voice, a voice that can be heard by her loud and clear, as it is not diluted by impossible multitudes. She can see the truth. She can listen. She can weep. As the movie builds up to the reveal of the last world, I looked around the room. Even before it was spoken, I could feel it. I think we all could, and in unison, we mumbled under our breaths. We mouthed it silently. Eo. All throughout the movie, there was this nonsensical voice speaking to her. The influencing voice was just noise. I couldn't make sense of it, and yet a few select words rang true, the same words I'd learned that day on set, when Hampton had asked me to read an excerpt, and still, even now, it brought images to my mind, the same images they've brought since that first day. An image of a blue fabric, fluttering in the wind, salt underneath my fingernails, a great fire. But others reacted differently, as if they heard different things. An older man in the back started laughing maniacally. Jonah just sunk his face into his hands, openly weeping. Looking over at Seb, he just shook his head in disbelief. "John deserves better," he mumbled. My boy deserves better." I think we all saw and heard what we wanted to, or, in a way, what we were meant to. Maybe they saw some version of their own truths, or heard a stutter of the same voice as the protagonist. Maybe they felt the same existential frost crawling up their spines as I did. Either way, as the lights came back on, it was dead quiet. Everyone just sat there looking straight ahead. You could have heard a pin drop. Roy Hampton took the stage again, but something was different. There was a sway to his step that I hadn't seen before. His back was straighter. His eyes looked different, colder. When he entered the middle of the stage, he relaxed his shoulder, taking a deep breath. I think we all saw something of ourselves. He smiled. We learned something new, much like I learned something the very first time I read this book. He showcased a thick, leather-bound manuscript, tapping it confidently. It said I was to make this movie, to show it to others, to give little glimpses of what could be, both in our lives and our lives to be. And at the end of the line, all those little glimpses would add up to one thing. Ariel stirred in her seat. Up until that point, she hadn't moved a muscle. At the end of it all, I'd come back, and I'd watch the world with new eyes and a beating heart. Hampton stepped forward, casually dropping the leather-bound script to the ground. Pages scattered across the stage. And finally, I live again. Everyone just looked at one another. A mumble rose through the crowd amidst the crying and giggling. Jonah put a hand on his mother's shoulder, trying to calm her. I looked at Seb, his eyes still red from tears. "He's Rask," Seb wheezed. "Hampton listened too much. He's Rask." I could see it. There was something there. Something I could recognize in the pit of my stomach, that could find me from across the room. I'd seen him that night in the woods, and by the fire on the set. I don't know how he did it, but this dead author somehow made his way back. That was him on stage, not director Roy Hampton. He looked at me with a gleeful smile. He drew breath and raised his hand. Something was about to happen. But before it did, there was a bang. Looking down at the row in front of me, I saw Ariel holding a shotgun with a strange symbol engraved on the barrel. Roy Hampton collapsed to the ground, clutching his stomach. Ariel was tackled, and Jonah was dragged off. People ran for the exits or dove to the floor. A few remained seated, staring blindly ahead, not even flinching at the gunshot. Hampton writhed in pain, clutching his stomach. It was a bad hit. His blood was so black that it seemed purple. It stained his clothes and hands. As he screamed and gasped, his voice became increasingly twisted, changing in pitch from high to low, back and forth, like he was cycling between young and old in a matter of seconds. It was this unearthly howling noise erupting into a voice, but not his own. Sa orak zent io, ru abgur vio gept io. The words poured out of him like torrent. Pointing with a bloodied hand at his audience, his screams cycled between horrifying and nonsensical, but with every breath something would happen. The first was the main theater door. The heavy rain had pooled outside, resulting in a flash flood. Those first few people who tried to get out were knocked off their feet, tumbling down the stairs. All the lights but the projector went out as the movie started up again on its own, playing from the halfway mark. The protagonist with the blue dress was superimposed on the bleeding body of Roy Hampton, who had forced himself back up to his knees as we all fumbled around in the dark. Yath Maugu Zevbreth Drick Auleth Eo Eo Eo. I didn't see what caused it, but I saw Ariel being flung across the room, picked up and flung with a massive force, at least 30 feet, instantly snapping her neck on impact with one of the second-floor balconies. Her lifeless body tumbled to the ground, gun still clinging to her hand. As Hampton wept tears of blood, pandemonium unleashed around us, as the world seemingly came apart. In the back there was a man whose body was turned to shadow. To this day I can't explain what he used to look like, or if it even was a man. It's as if he'd been erased in every way but the immediate visual sense that he was there. I saw a woman whose eyes were burned from the inside out, an old man spewing up dirt in the front row. Jonah was crawling towards his mother as little white bioluminescent bugs poured out of his head. A sulfuric wind blew through the room, burning through my nose and throat, and despite it all, I grabbed Seb by the shoulder and headed for one of the emergency exits. There were flashes of light going off behind us. I could see things in my periphery. Tall things, short things, transparent and solid. There were discolored sunflowers creeping out of cracks in the wall, seemingly reaching for us, as whatever Hampton had become continued to unravel. The audience kept running. It felt like a gauntlet. People were disappearing around us. There was this massive red-feathered bird creature who tore into an old man ahead of us, dragging him into a bathroom stall. Someone tripped on a molar tooth growing out of the carpet. There was a short man in the far back that just evaporated into a cloud of flies. Even halfway through the building, I could hear him screaming. It reverberated through the walls, rattling my bones. There were flashes of something different corridors with different people. With every step, I'd be someone, somewhere else. I'd be young, I'd be old. For one breath I was Seb, watching his scar on my own hand. It's as if we were piercing a barrier, losing a semblance of order that our mind required to function. Then it was dark, cold. I would feel my body stiffen. I grew elongated, unfeeling, and unreal. In that moment I thought it was over. I thought that'd be it. I had this vision of worlds beyond, and the many instances of lives I would come to lose. But one thing kept coming back to me, the words I'd understood all the way back when, an image of blue fabric fluttering in the wind, salt under my fingernails, a great fire. This wasn't it. Not yet. I drew breath as we turned a corner. I was there. The carpet under my feet was real, and the screams of the maimed and dying were piercing my ears. As Seb and I made our way out the emergency exit and the alarms began to wail, I heard a scream for help. Instinctively I reached out an arm, pulling someone along. I don't know who it was, nor did I care. Seb hurried ahead, keeping the door open, crying out for me to hurry. We all collapsed outside, scrambling to get to a safe distance. Only 3 of us made it out that night. Me, Seb, and this mysterious woman I had managed to drag along. Turns out that was Edith M. Carroll, one of the movie's co-writers. I hadn't recognized her in the crowd. As the chaos inside the venue rose to a crescendo, a lightning bolt struck the roof of the building. I could see the clouds part above for a split second. Then it was over. No screams, no death, just this one bright light, thunder, and then the pitter-patter of a calming storm. It was done. They later said the theater collapsed from an unsupported roof, exacerbated by the downpour. To this day, no one really knows how many people died in there. It's as if everyone just forgot they even existed. The only name mentioned in the articles were Roy Hampton, who was credited as a philanthropist and esoteric scholar. The 3 of us who made it out could finally put an end to it all. While the answers we got weren't necessarily what we wanted, we could at least say that this was it. There was nothing more for us to look into regarding Roy Hampton and the end of eternity. And yet, it was an empty victory. Pyric. As we rested outside, waiting for the sirens to stop, we spoke in hushed tones. Seb had trouble focusing, rubbing the scar on his hand. If I find anything else, I'll let you know, he said. Sounds like a plan. I nodded. We held hands for a while, just 2 people ensuring one another that somehow things were going to be okay. It didn't exactly turn out that way, but it never really does. That night was the last time I saw Seb Digman. He died about 8 years later to a kind of metal poisoning. According to his kids, it had been something he'd had in his system for years, maybe even the whole time I knew him. I eventually dated and married Edith, the one this whole story began with. That's how I know of her work at the bakery and the community college. We'd been married for decades, right up until her passing not too long ago. But it was only a matter of time. For years, she had cried to me about what she'd seen that night at the screening, her death, staring into her own face as life slipped from her. Maybe that's why she choked in the bathroom. I don't know. There was also the case of Dawn Anderson. It's strange. She's still around. My oldest son showed me a video of her on YouTube not too long ago. She makes videos under some strange synonym. She looks different, but it's the same woman. I can tell. I've researched Rask over the years, trying to make sense of the things I've seen and experienced. I wanted to understand what Hampton's obsession was about. I haven't found a complete copy of that manuscript, though, and I count that as a blessing. Neither are there any remaining copies of this film, The End of Eternity. Not that I can track down, at least. Maybe there's a forgotten tape in the back of a closet somewhere. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've started to realize the ingenious nature of his work. That by reading, experiencing, and understanding his work, Emmett Rask can manifest. He can always come back. A concept cannot be forgotten. Information doesn't go away just because we don't know it. It's still there. I don't know how to assemble a phone, but I can still call my grandchildren. Just because I don't know how doesn't mean the information doesn't exist. That's how Rask exists. He just is. And whenever someone looks a bit closer, or listens a bit too eagerly, he makes his way back. He learns his way back, little by little. I've come to terms with what is going to happen next. I was kept alive out of circumstance. Rask wanted someone to live long enough to learn just enough to bring him back again. For someone to invest, experience, and become. That's what he wanted for me. But I think he forgot one thing. The images shown to me. The words I'd been given. Blue fabric, fluttering in the wind. Salt under my fingernails. A great fire. Looking back at my long life, the very first picture of me and my mother was at a hospital. She wrapped me in a blue blanket, leaving the window open to welcome the spring wind. That was my very first earthly experience. The night that Edith and I conceived our first child was on our honeymoon, on an Italian beach in late July. I remember it for many reasons, but the salt crystals beneath my fingernails on that very night meant something. Even then I could feel it. And now, as I write this excessive and maddening recollection, I look at what is to come. A repeating pattern coming to a close. Perhaps I'll learn a little too much, a little too soon. Maybe the act of writing all this down will bring it to the surface and send Rask roaring back with a vengeance. But I don't think it will. As I look across my desk, at the last of Edith's scented candles, I think what is going to happen has long since been established. And as I wait, putting these final words to paper, I think it will be okay. While there may be an end to eternity, there are so many more things to understand than we'll ever grasp. So with that, I leave you with this. We have to accept the mystery. There will never be an end to questions, no matter the answers. And at the end of the line, we must embrace the great fire to come.